Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Ottawa National Forest, deep in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, during what was supposed to be the most romantic weekend of our lives. Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd gotten engaged 3 weeks earlier, and she'd been dropping hints about wanting to go somewhere wild and untouched to celebrate. The Ottawa National Forest seemed perfect, over 1 million acres of dense wilderness, with some of the most remote backcountry camping in the Midwest. I'd found a trail that led to an unnamed lake about 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a barely marked path that wound through old-growth pine and cedar. "It'll be perfect," Sarah had said, her dark eyes sparkling as she traced the route on my laptop screen. "Just you, me, and nothing but wilderness for miles." I should have paid more attention to the warnings. We started our hike early Friday morning from the Crystal Falls area, parking my Jeep at a forgotten logging road that barely qualified as 2 tire tracks through the underbrush. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of dying leaves and something else, something organic and slightly sour that I couldn't quite place. Sarah looked beautiful in her hiking gear, her long black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her cheeks already flushed pink from the cool air. "Ready for our adventure, future husband?" she asked, shouldering her pack with a grin. The first day went perfectly. We made good time on the trail, stopping frequently to take pictures and steal kisses among the towering pines. The forest was magnificent. Ancient trees that blocked out most of the sky, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that made us whisper even when we were alone. We reached the lake by late afternoon and set up camp on a small peninsula that jutted into the dark water. That first night, sitting by our campfire as Sarah roasted marshmallows and talked about our wedding plans, I felt like the luckiest man alive. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the darkness beyond our small circle of light. "I love you," I told her as we crawled into our tent, and she kissed me with lips that tasted like smoke and sugar. "I love you too," she whispered back, "forever and always." The problems started the next morning. I woke to find our campfire had somehow rekindled itself during the night. That was impossible. I'd made sure to douse it completely before we went to bed, stirring the ashes until they were cold to the touch. But there it was, burning with bright blue flames that gave off no heat and smelled like rotting meat. "Sarah," I said, shaking her gently, "wake up. Something's wrong with the fire." She sat up slowly, blinking in confusion. When she looked toward the fire pit, her face went pale. That's not normal." I grabbed our water bottles and doused the flames. They went out immediately, leaving behind nothing but normal-looking ash and charcoal. No blue color, no smell, as if nothing had happened. "Maybe I didn't put it out as well as I thought," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. Sarah nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "Yeah, maybe." We tried to use my GPS to double-check our location, but the device showed only static. My phone had no signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the wilderness, but the compass app kept spinning wildly, never settling on a direction. Even Sarah's old analog compass seemed confused, the needle swinging back and forth like it couldn't decide which way was north. "Technology, right?" I said with a forced laugh. "Good thing we have the map." But when I unfolded our topographical map, the paper felt wrong under my fingers. Slightly damp and almost organic, like skin. The printed landmarks seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the blue line that marked our lake appeared to be in the wrong place entirely. "The map's wrong," Sarah said, leaning over my shoulder. Her breath felt cold against my neck. "This isn't where we are." I refolded the map quickly, trying to ignore how it seemed to stick to my hands. "We'll figure it out. We know generally which direction we came from. But I wasn't sure of that anymore. We decided to spend a second night at the lake and then head back in the morning. The rest of Saturday passed uneventfully, though I kept noticing things that bothered me. Our food was disappearing faster than it should have. The bag of trail mix that should have lasted the whole trip was nearly empty by afternoon, and I could have sworn we'd brought more energy bars. Sarah seemed hungrier than usual too, constantly snacking and complaining that she couldn't get full. "I feel like I haven't eaten in days," she said that evening, gnawing on a piece of beef jerky with unusual intensity. "Like there's this hollow feeling inside me that just won't go away." That night, the dreams started. I dreamed of something moving through the forest, something tall and impossibly thin, with 2 long limbs and fingers that ended in yellow claws. It moved between the trees with fluid grace, never quite visible in the moonlight, but always there, always watching. In my dream, it spoke to me in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "Hungry," it whispered, "so hungry, so long since the feast." I woke with a gasp to find our tent filled with the smell of decay. Sarah was sitting up beside me, perfectly still, staring at the tent wall with wide, unblinking eyes. "Sarah?" I whispered. She turned to look at me, and for just a moment, in the dim light filtering through the tent fabric, her eyes seemed to reflect like an animal's. But then she blinked, and they were normal again. "I had the strangest dream," she said softly. "There was something in the forest, something that was calling to me." "Me too," I admitted. "Maybe we should pack up and leave first thing in the morning." She nodded, but I noticed she kept glancing toward the tent entrance as if listening for something. Sunday morning brought new horrors. Our hiking boots were arranged in a perfect circle around the cold fire pit, even though we'd left them scattered by the tent entrance. More disturbing, there were footprints in the soft earth around our camp, barefoot prints that were almost human, but wrong, somehow. Too narrow, with toes that seemed too long and spread too wide. "Animals," I said, though I didn't believe it. Sarah was examining the prints more closely, and when she looked up at me, there was something different in her expression. A kind of hunger I'd never seen before. "They're not animal tracks," she said quietly. "There's something else." We broke camp quickly, both of us eager to get back to civilization. But the trail that had been clear on our way in seemed to have vanished. We found ourselves walking through dense underbrush, pushing through branches that caught at our clothes and skin. The trees seemed closer together than before, and the sky was almost completely blocked out by the canopy overhead. "This isn't right," I said, consulting the useless map again. "We should have hit the main trail by now." Sarah had stopped walking and was standing perfectly still, her head tilted to one side as if listening to something. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened carefully. At first, there was only the normal forest sounds, wind in the branches, the distant call of a bird, but then I heard it too, a low, humming sound like singing, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. "We should go the other way," I said, but Sarah was already walking toward the sound. "Sarah, stop," I called after her, but she didn't seem to hear me. She moved through the trees with an odd, fluid grace, never stumbling over roots or getting caught on branches. I followed, crashing through the underbrush as quietly as I could. The humming grew louder as we moved deeper into the forest, and I began to make out words in a language I didn't recognize. The melody was hypnotic, beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. We emerged into a clearing I was certain hadn't been there before. In the center stood a massive pine tree, easily 200 feet tall and so old it might have been growing when the first Europeans arrived in Michigan. Carved into its bark were symbols that hurt to look at, spiraling patterns that seemed to move when I tried to focus on them. And standing beneath the tree was a figure. It might have been human once, but hunger had changed it into something else. It was impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that looked stretched like taffy. Its skin was pale gray, pulled tight over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. But the worst part was its face, or what remained of it. The eyes were yellow and bright with intelligence, and the mouth was filled with too many teeth, all of them sharp. When it saw us, it smiled. "Welcome," it said in a voice like autumn wind. "I've been waiting so long for visitors." Sarah stepped forward and I grabbed her arm to stop her. Her skin felt cold under my fingers, almost frozen. "Don't," I whispered, but she pulled away from me with strength I didn't know she possessed. "It's beautiful," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "Can't you see how beautiful it is?" I looked at the creature again, and for just a moment I thought I understood what she meant. There was something mesmerizing about it, something that spoke to a primal part of my brain. But then survival instinct kicked in, and all I could see was a predator. "Sarah, we need to leave, now." She turned to look at me and her eyes were completely black. "But I'm so hungry, Daniel, and it knows how to make the hunger stop." The creature laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "She understands. The young woman has potential. The old ways run strong in her blood." I didn't understand what it meant, but I knew we were in terrible danger. I grabbed Sarah's hand and tried to pull her away from the clearing, but she wouldn't budge. She was staring at the creature with complete fascination. "Tell me," she said to it. "Tell me how to stop being hungry." "First, you must feed," the creature replied. "Feed on the one you love most. Take his warmth, his life, his essence. Let it fill the emptiness inside you." Sarah nodded as if this made perfect sense. That's when I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches tearing at my face and clothes, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. Behind me, I could hear Sarah calling my name, but her voice didn't sound right anymore. It was too deep, too resonant, echoing strangely among the trees. "Daniel, where are you going? Come back, I need you." I didn't stop running until I couldn't hear her voice anymore. When I finally collapsed against a massive oak tree, gasping for breath, I tried to figure out where I was. The forest around me looked completely unfamiliar. The trees were different, older, more twisted, with bark that seemed to have faces in it when I looked at it from the corner of my eye. The undergrowth was thick with plants I didn't recognize, some of them moving slightly even though there was no wind. I checked my watch. It was 3:47 p.m., but the light filtering through the canopy looked like late evening. My phone was completely dead, even though it had been at 80% battery that morning. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. The forest had become a maze, and I was hopelessly lost. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time didn't seem to work properly anymore. Sometimes the light would suddenly change from dim afternoon to deep twilight in the span of a few minutes. Other times, I would walk for what felt like hours, only to check my watch and find that no time had passed at all. I was starting to think I was losing my mind when I heard Sarah calling for me again. "Daniel, please, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened back there. I need help." Her voice sounded normal now, desperate and afraid. But I remembered the black eyes, the way she'd spoken to that creature. I stayed hidden behind a fallen log, barely breathing. "Daniel, please, something's wrong with me. I can't remember. I think something happened to me in that clearing. I need you to help me." She sounded so scared, so much like the woman I loved, that I almost called out to her. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way the forest went completely silent when she spoke, as if even the birds and insects were afraid. I waited until her voice faded into the distance before I started moving again. The sun was setting, or at least what passed for sunset in this increasingly wrong version of the forest, when I saw the light ahead. It flickered between the trees like a campfire, and for a moment I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was other campers. Maybe they could help me find my way out. But as I got closer, I realized it was my own campfire. Somehow, I'd walked in a circle and ended up back at our campsite by the lake. The fire was burning with those same blue flames from the night before, and sitting beside it was Sarah. She looked up when she heard me approaching and smiled. It was her smile, warm and loving, but there was something else behind it, something hungry. "There you are," she said. I was so worried about you. I found our camp again, and I've been waiting for you to come back. I stayed at the edge of the firelight, every instinct screaming at me to run again. What happened in the clearing, Sarah? I don't know what you mean, she said, tilting her head to one side. What clearing? We've been here the whole time. But I could see that her canine teeth were longer than they should be, and her fingernails had grown into claws. You talked to something, I said. That creature under the tree. It told you to feed on me. Sarah's expression didn't change, but the firelight seemed to flicker in her eyes. Daniel, you're scaring me. I think the stress of being lost is getting to you. Why don't you come sit down? I made dinner. She gestured to a makeshift spit over the fire, where something was roasting. The smell should have been appetizing, but it made my stomach turn. The meat was too pale, and I could swear I saw fingers among the charred flesh. What is that? Rabbit, she said quickly. I caught a rabbit while you were gone. But I could see bones in the dirt around the fire that were definitely not from a rabbit. They were too long, too curved, human-shaped. Sarah, I said carefully, I think something's wrong with you. That thing in the clearing, it did something to you. Her smile faltered for just a moment, and I saw something else flicker across her features, something ancient and terrifyingly hungry. Nothing's wrong with me, she said. I'm better than I've ever been. I'm not hungry anymore, Daniel. For the first time in my life, I'm not hungry. She stood up, and I noticed that she moved differently now. Too fluid, too graceful, like the creature in the clearing. I want to share this feeling with you, she continued, taking a step toward me. I want to take away your hunger too. All you have to do is let me. I backed away from the fire, my hand closing around the handle of my hiking knife. Stay back, Sarah. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. She laughed, and the sound was nothing like her real laugh. It was the sound of wind through dead leaves, of bones breaking, of something starving finally finding food. You can't hurt me, Daniel. Nothing can hurt me now. I'm beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond death. All I feel is the hunger and the beautiful knowledge that I can feed it. Her eyes went completely black again, and when she opened her mouth I could see that all of her teeth were sharp now. I turned and ran into the forest. This time, I had a plan. I'd noticed that the wrongness seemed strongest near the water and the clearing where we'd met the creature. If I could get far enough away from both, maybe I could find a way out of whatever this place had become. I ran through the darkness, using my flashlight sparingly to save the batteries. Behind me, I could hear Sarah, or the thing that had been Sarah, crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. She was fast, much faster than she should have been, but she seemed to be toying with me, letting me get ahead, then catching up just enough to let me know she was still there. You can't run forever, Daniel, she called out. I know these woods now, every tree, every path, every shadow. They speak to me. I tried to ignore her voice and focus on escape. The forest around me was definitely changing as I moved. The trees were getting smaller, less twisted, the undergrowth was thinning out, and most importantly, I was starting to see stars through the canopy. Hope flared in my chest. Maybe I was getting close to the edge of whatever supernatural territory I'd stumbled into. But Sarah's voice was getting closer. I can smell your fear, Daniel. It's delicious, but it will taste even better when I'm drinking it directly from your veins. I risked a look back and immediately wished I hadn't. Sarah was visible in the moonlight about 50 yards behind me, but she wasn't entirely Sarah anymore. Her limbs were too long, her fingers ended in claws, and she moved with the same unnatural grace as the creature from the clearing. Worse, she wasn't alone. There were others with her. Pale, elongated figures that flitted between the trees like ghosts. Some of them might have been human once, but hunger had changed them into something else entirely. They were all following my scent, and they were gaining ground. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the stabbing pain in my side. Ahead, I could see a break in the trees that might have been a road or a clearing. If I could just reach it. Something grabbed my ankle. I went down hard, my flashlight spinning away into the darkness. When I rolled over, Sarah was standing above me, but the transformation was complete now. She looked like the creature from the clearing, tall, impossibly thin, with yellow eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. "Caught you," she said in a voice that was nothing like Sarah's. The other creatures emerged from the shadows, forming a circle around me. Up close, I could see that they had once been human. Hikers, maybe, or campers like us who had gotten lost and fallen prey to whatever force controlled this part of the forest. "Please," I gasped. "Sarah, I know you're still in there somewhere. Fight this." The thing that had been Sarah tilted its head, considering. "Sarah," it said thoughtfully. "Yes, I remember her. She loved you very much. She was going to marry you. But she's gone now, Daniel. I consumed her along with her hunger." It knelt down beside me and I could smell decay on its breath. "But don't worry," it continued. "Soon you'll join her. We'll make the change slowly, so you can feel every moment of your humanity slipping away. And when it's done, you'll understand what a gift this is. No more pain, no more fear, no more empty longing. Just the hunt and the feast and the beautiful satisfaction of feeding." I closed my eyes and waited for the end. But instead of claws, I felt something else, a warmth spreading through my chest, familiar and comforting. When I opened my eyes, Sarah was kneeling beside me, but she looked like herself again. Her eyes were brown instead of yellow, her teeth were normal, and tears were streaming down her face. "Daniel," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I fought it as long as I could, but it was so strong. The hunger was so strong." Around us, the other creatures were backing away, hissing and snarling. Whatever force Sarah was drawing on, they didn't like it. "How?" I asked. "Love," she said simply. "I remembered how much I love you, and it gave me strength to push the hunger back. But I can't hold it for long. You have to run. Now." I struggled to my feet, but I couldn't leave her. "Come with me." She shook her head. "I can't. I'm part of this now. The hunger is still there, Daniel. I can feel it waiting to take control again. If I leave this place, I'll hurt innocent people. I'll hurt you." The creatures were moving closer again, and I could see the yellow returning to Sarah's eyes. "Go!" she screamed. "Run!" This time, I listened. I ran through the forest as the sounds of battle erupted behind me. Sarah's voice, human again, screaming defiance at the creatures that had claimed her. Other voices, inhuman and angry, responding with sounds that no throat should be able to make. I reached the break in the trees and found myself on a dirt road. A real road, with tire tracks and everything. In the distance, I could see headlights approaching. I flagged down the truck, a Forestry Service vehicle driven by a ranger who took one look at me and immediately radioed for help. I was covered in scratches and blood, incoherent with exhaustion and terror, and probably looked like I'd been through hell. Which, in a way, I had. The search and rescue team found our campsite 3 days later, but there was no sign of Sarah. No sign of the blue flames, the carved tree, or the creatures. Just our tent and gear, exactly as we'd left them, beside a perfectly normal lake that appeared on every map exactly where it was supposed to be. They found Sarah's body a week later, at the bottom of the lake. The official cause of death was drowning, though the coroner noted some unusual scratches and bite marks that he attributed to scavenger animals. I never told anyone the truth about what happened. Who would believe me? Instead, I let them think Sarah had gone swimming and drowned, and that I'd gotten lost trying to find help. It was easier than explaining about creatures that shouldn't exist and forests that changed themselves when you weren't looking. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about those woods. I dream about Sarah calling my name in a voice that's almost right, but not quite. In the dreams, she's still out there, still fighting the hunger, still trying to remember who she used to be. And sometimes, when I wake up from those dreams, I find scratches on my arms that weren't there when I went to sleep. I've never gone camping again. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 24 years old. This happened in the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park in Michigan's Upper Peninsula 3 weeks ago. I'm writing this from a hospital bed in Marquette, my left leg still in a cast, my hands still shaking every time I close my eyes. The three of us, Sarah Rodriguez, Kevin King, and myself, had planned this trip for months. We were all recent graduates from Michigan State, and Kevin had this romantic notion about reconnecting with nature before we all started our adult jobs. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, had researched every trail, every campsite, every emergency protocol. I just wanted to get away from my parents' basement and the suffocating weight of post-graduation uncertainty. We drove up on a Thursday morning in October when the maples were bleeding crimson and the air carried that sharp bite that promises winter. The Porcupine Mountains stretched before us like a sleeping beast, all dense forests and rolling ridges draped in fog. Kevin had insisted on the most remote trail, the Lake of the Clouds circuit that would take us deep into the backcountry, away from the casual day hikers and RV campers. "Look at this place," Kevin said as we shouldered our packs at the Summit Peak trailhead. "It's like stepping back in time. Native Americans hunted these woods for thousands of years." Sarah checked her GPS for the third time. Signal's already getting spotty. Good thing I brought the paper maps. She was always prepared, the kind of person who packed extra batteries and emergency flares. If I'd listened to her warnings about this place, maybe we'd all still be... But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first day was perfect. We hiked the escarpment trail as golden light filtered through the canopy, our boots crunching through leaves that seemed to whisper secrets with every step. The forest felt alive but benevolent, like a grandmother's embrace. We made camp at one of the designated backcountry sites near the Lake of the Clouds overlook, a small clearing surrounded by towering hemlocks that creaked and sighed in the wind. That evening, as we sat around our campfire eating dehydrated pasta, Kevin regaled us with stories he'd researched about the area. The Ojibwe considered these mountains sacred, he said, firelight dancing across his face. They believed certain spirits lived here, hungry spirits that grew stronger in the winter months. "Wendigo stories," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "Every northern forest has them. Cannibalistic monsters born from desperation and isolation. It's just a way ancient people explained cabin fever and starvation psychosis." I should have paid more attention to the way the fire seemed to dim when she said that word. Should have noticed how the night sounds, the hoot of owls, the rustle of small animals, had completely stopped. Instead, I laughed and poked at the flames with a stick. "Come on, Sarah. Where's your sense of adventure? We're out here in the middle of nowhere, no cell service, nothing but wilderness for miles. If you can't enjoy a good ghost story now, when can you?" The fire flared suddenly, shooting sparks into the darkness that seemed to hang around our small circle of light like hungry eyes. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something moving just beyond the tree line. Something big, shifting its weight from foot to foot with a rhythm that was almost human, but not quite. We went to bed around 10, zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags as the temperature dropped toward freezing. I lay awake for a while, listening to the absolute silence that only exists in deep wilderness. No traffic, no air conditioners, no human sounds at all. Just the occasional crack of settling wood and the whisper of wind through pine needles. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of Sarah's voice, low and urgent outside the tent. "Michael, Kevin, wake up." I unzipped my sleeping bag, immediately feeling the sharp bite of cold air against my skin. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "The fire's out," she said, "but that's not... Just come look at this." Kevin and I stumbled out of the tent, flashlights in hand. Where our campfire had been, there was nothing but a circle of white ash that looked like it had been cold for hours. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the smell. A sweet, sickly odor like meat left too long in the sun, mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. "I could have sworn I banked it properly," Kevin said, kneeling beside the dead fire. "And this ash, it should still be warm." Sarah was scanning the tree line with her flashlight. "There's something else. Our food bags, they're gone. I felt ice form in my stomach. We'd hung our food properly, 12 feet up and 6 feet from the nearest tree trunk, exactly as the park regulations required. The rope was still there, but it had been cut cleanly, not chewed through by animals. "Bears don't use knives," Sarah said quietly. We spent the next hour searching the immediate area, finding nothing but those strange smells that seemed to drift through the forest like smoke. And there was something else bothering me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on until Sarah pointed it out. "Look at your watch," she said. I did. It read 3:47 a.m., but when I'd woken up, I could have sworn it was just after midnight, and I hadn't felt like I'd been searching for almost 4 hours. "Mine stopped at 12:23, Kevin said, tapping his digital display. "That's impossible. This is a new watch." We tried to restart the fire, but the matches wouldn't catch properly. The flames would flicker for a moment, then die as if something was sucking the oxygen away. Even Sarah's emergency lighter produced only weak blue flames that couldn't seem to catch the kindling. "We need to hike out," Sarah said. "Something's not right here." But Kevin, stubborn as always, convinced us to wait until morning. "We're probably just spooked. Things always seem worse in the dark. Let's get some sleep and reassess when we have daylight." I wish to God we'd listened to Sarah. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the forest like a weight. Our remaining food, the stuff we'd kept in the tent, had gone bad overnight. Not just stale, but actively rotting, covered in a white fungus that should have taken weeks to develop. Even our water had a strange metallic taste that made me gag. "Okay," Kevin said, staring at a granola bar that was now covered in what looked like black mold. "This is officially weird." We packed quickly, eager to put distance between ourselves and the cursed campsite. But as we started down the trail, our compass began spinning wildly, never settling on true north. Sarah's GPS couldn't find any satellites, and the paper maps seemed to show trails that didn't match what we were seeing on the ground. "This is impossible," Sarah muttered, comparing her topographic map to the terrain around us. "According to this, there should be a creek here, but look around. Nothing but dry ground." The forest itself felt different too. Where yesterday it had seemed welcoming, now it felt hostile, watching. The trees stood too close together, their branches interlocked overhead like skeletal fingers, and the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no small mammals rustling through the undergrowth. Just our breathing and the soft thud of our boots on the leaf-covered trail. We'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours when Kevin stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" I strained to listen. At first, nothing. Then, just at the edge of hearing, a sound like singing. A woman's voice, high and sweet, drifting through the trees from somewhere ahead of us. "That's not possible," Sarah said. "We're miles from the nearest road. There shouldn't be anyone else out here." But the singing continued, seeming to come from just around the next bend. It was hauntingly beautiful. A melody I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. And despite the wrongness of it, I felt drawn forward, like the music was pulling me along the trail. "We should investigate," Kevin said. "Maybe someone's lost. Maybe they need help." Sarah grabbed his arm. "No, something's wrong here. We need to turn around, find another way out." But I was already walking toward the sound, my feet moving almost without conscious thought. The melody was clearer now, and I could make out words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was singing about hunger, about the long cold winter ahead, about the sweetness of warm flesh and flowing blood. I stopped so abruptly that Kevin bumped into me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" "The singing." "No, the words. It was singing about—" I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak those horrible words out loud. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. And in that silence, I heard something else. Footsteps moving through the forest parallel to our trail. Not the careful, measured steps of a human hiker, but something else. something that moved with a strange loping gait that covered ground faster than it should. "Run," Sarah whispered. We ran. Behind us, the footsteps increased their pace, crashing through the undergrowth with inhuman speed. Branches snapped like gunshots. Something was gaining on us, moving through the dense forest as easily as we moved along the trail. I risked a glance back and saw something that my mind refused to process. A tall, impossibly thin figure keeping pace with us about 50 yards back, moving between the trees with fluid grace. It was too far away to make out details, but there was something wrong with its proportions. Something that made my hindbrain scream in terror. We reached a fork in the trail and Sarah yanked us to the left, down a steep slope toward what her map claimed was Mirror Lake. The ground was treacherous, covered in wet leaves that made every step a potential fall. But the sound of pursuit drove us forward, sliding and stumbling down the mountainside. At the bottom, we found not a lake but a dry depression filled with the bones of animals. Deer, mostly, but other things too. Things that might have been human once, scattered and gnawed clean. The smell here was overwhelming. That same sickly sweet odor from our campsite, but concentrated, nauseating. "Jesus Christ," Kevin breathed. Something howled behind us, a sound like wind through a graveyard that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We scrambled up the far side of the bone pit, branches tearing at our clothes, and kept running. For the rest of that day, we were hunted. Every time we thought we'd lost our pursuer, we'd hear it again. Sometimes behind us, sometimes to our left or right, sometimes, impossibly, ahead of us. It was like it knew these woods intimately, like it could predict our every move. We finally stopped at sunset, exhausted and terrified, in a small grove of birch trees that offered little protection but was the best we could find. We didn't dare light a fire. We huddled together in the growing darkness, sharing body heat and what little water we had left. "What do you think it is?" Kevin whispered. Sarah's voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. "I don't know. But we need to be smarter about this. It's faster than us. It knows these woods better than us. Our only advantage is that we can think, plan." "The ranger station," I said. "If we can reach the ranger station at Union Bay, we'll be safe." "That's 20 miles, Sarah said. "And we don't even know where we are." That's when Kevin made his suggestion. "One of us should go for help. The other two stay here, try to hide until rescue comes." "No," Sarah said immediately. "We stick together." But Kevin was already standing up. "I'm the fastest runner. I can make better time alone, without having to worry about keeping the group together." I should have stopped him, should have tackled him, tied him to a tree, anything to keep us together. But I was exhausted and scared and not thinking clearly. So I watched him disappear into the darkness, promising to bring help by morning. That was the last time I saw Kevin alive. Sarah and I spent the worst night of our lives huddled in that grove, listening to sounds in the darkness that human ears were never meant to hear. Scraping like claws on bark. Sniffing like a dog following a scent trail. And once, just before dawn, something that might have been Kevin's voice calling our names from somewhere far off in the forest. We didn't answer. When morning came, gray and cold, we found Kevin's backpack hanging from a tree branch about 100 yards from our hiding spot. It was shredded, the contents scattered and partially eaten. But there was no sign of Kevin himself. No blood, no tracks leading away. Just his gear, destroyed as if by some enormous predator. "We have to keep moving," Sarah said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. She was pale, her hands shaking as she shouldered her pack. We walked for hours that day, following deer trails and dry creek beds, desperately seeking any landmark that matched our maps. But the forest seemed to shift around us like a living thing. Paths we'd taken in the morning were gone by afternoon. Hills we'd climbed appeared in front of us again hours later, as if the landscape was folding in on itself, and always, just at the edge of perception, we could sense our pursuer. Sometimes it was the snap of a branch in the distance. Sometimes it was a smell carried on the wind, that sickly sweet rot that made our stomachs turn. Sometimes it was just a feeling, the certainty that we were being watched by something that saw us as prey. It was late afternoon when Sarah said she needed to gather firewood. "No," I said immediately. "We stay together. Michael, we need warmth. It's going to drop below freezing tonight, and we're both showing signs of hypothermia." Her lips were blue, her words slightly slurred. She was right. We needed fire or we'd die of exposure. "Then we go together. We don't split up." But Sarah was already walking toward a fallen log about 30 yards away. "I'll be right back. Keep talking so I can hear you." I should have followed her, should have grabbed her arm and dragged her back, but I was so tired, so cold, and 30 yards seemed like nothing. I could see her the whole time, moving carefully among the deadfall, selecting pieces of wood. I looked away for maybe 10 seconds to check our remaining water. When I looked back, she was gone. "Sarah," I called. "Sarah!" Nothing. I ran to where I'd last seen her, but there was no sign of her passage. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed leaves, nothing. It was like she'd simply vanished. I spent the next hour searching, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. The forest swallowed my shouts without even an echo, and as darkness began to fall, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Singing. The same beautiful, haunting melody we'd heard yesterday, but now I recognized the voice. It was Sarah, but not Sarah. The tone was right, but there was something underneath it, something that suggested vast hunger and endless cold. I followed the sound deeper into the forest, flashlight beam dancing through the trees. The singing led me in a winding path through increasingly dense undergrowth, past fallen logs that looked like sleeping giants and rocks that seemed to watch my passage with hollow eyes. I found her in a clearing I was certain hadn't been there moments before. Sarah sat cross-legged in the center of the space, her back to me, still singing that otherworldly melody. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and in the glow of my flashlight it seemed to have a strange silvery sheen. "Sarah," I called. "Thank God, I've been looking everywhere for you." She stopped singing, but didn't turn around. "Sarah, are you okay?" Slowly, she began to turn, and I saw immediately that something was wrong. Her movement was too fluid, like her spine had too many joints, and when she finally faced me, my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was Sarah's face, but subtly wrong. Her eyes were too large, the pupils dilated despite the bright flashlight beam. Her smile was too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be, and her skin had a grayish pallor that made her look corpse-like in the harsh LED light. "Michael," she said, and her voice was definitely Sarah's voice, but there was something else underneath it, something that spoke with the whisper of winter wind and the crack of breaking bones. "I've been waiting for you." Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What happened? Where have you been?" She stood up in one smooth motion, rising to her full height without using her hands. "I met someone in the woods, Michael. Someone who showed me what I really am. What we all really are, deep down." Her smile widened impossibly. "We're meat, Michael. Just walking, talking meat." I took a step backward. "Sarah, this isn't you. You're sick, or hypothermic, or—" "I'm hungry," she interrupted, and her voice had changed completely now. It was still recognizably Sarah's voice, but layered with something else, something that sounded like it came from the bottom of a very deep well. "So very, very hungry." She began walking toward me, and I noticed that her feet weren't quite touching the ground. She glided across the forest floor like she was floating, her two wide eyes never leaving mine. I ran. Behind me, I heard laughter. Sarah's laughter, but wrong, multiplied somehow until it seemed to come from a dozen throats. And underneath the laughter, something else. A howl that seemed to shake the very trees. a sound of such primal hunger that it turned my legs to water. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches tearing at my face and clothes, roots trying to trip me at every step. My flashlight beam danced wildly, creating a strobe effect that turned the woods into a nightmare landscape of reaching shadows and grasping claws. Something was gaining on me. I could hear it moving through the trees with impossible speed, breaking branches like matchsticks. And worse, I could hear Sarah's voice calling my name in a sing-song tone that promised terrible things. "Michael. Come back, Michael. I want to show you something. I want to show you how good it feels to be hungry." I risked a glance back and saw her, or the thing that had been her, bounding through the forest on all fours, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Her limbs seemed too long now, her fingers extended into claws, and her face— God, her face had changed into something that might have been human once but was now something else entirely. I stumbled into a creek bed and followed it downstream, splashing through ankle-deep water that was so cold it made my feet numb almost immediately. The thing behind me howled again, a sound of frustration and rage that echoed off the rocky walls of the ravine. The creek led me to a series of limestone caves, dark openings in the hillside that promised shelter but might also be traps. I had no choice. I could hear my pursuer getting closer, could smell that sickly sweet rot that seemed to follow it everywhere. I chose the largest cave opening and plunged into absolute darkness. The cave was deeper than I'd expected, a network of tunnels and chambers that stretched back into the heart of the mountain. I turned off my flashlight to conserve the battery and felt my way along the rough stone walls, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the entrance. Behind me, I heard the thing that had been Sarah enter the cave. Its breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow like a panting dog, and it was sniffing, following my scent trail through the darkness. I kept moving deeper, hands outstretched, feet testing each step carefully. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I fought down waves of claustrophobic panic. I'd rather die buried alive than face what was hunting me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the absolute darkness. I found a narrow crevice in the cave wall and wedged myself inside, trying to control my breathing and heartbeat. The thing was still hunting, still sniffing along my trail, but the scent of the cave, limestone and mineral water and ancient darkness, seemed to confuse it. I might have dozed, it's hard to say, but I was jolted back to full awareness by the sound of Sarah's voice, much closer than it should have been. "Michael, I know you're in here. I can smell you. You smell like fear and warm blood and all the good things." A pause, then a sound like fingernails scraping against stone. "I found Kevin, you know. He tasted so sweet. But he wasn't enough. Nothing is ever enough." I pressed myself deeper into the crevice, feeling sharp stone cut into my back. The thing was moving through the cave system methodically, checking every hiding place. It was only a matter of time before it found me. "I remember being Sarah," the voice continued, now from a different direction. "I remember caring about you, about Kevin. Funny, isn't it? How small those feelings seem now. How insignificant. All that matters is the hunger, the beautiful, endless hunger." I could hear it getting closer, its breathing echoing off the cave walls. And then, horribly, I heard it begin to sing again, that same haunting melody, but now I could understand every word. It was singing about the taste of human flesh, about the crack of bones between teeth, about the ecstasy of feeding. My flashlight was dying. The beam had faded to a dim yellow glow that barely illuminated my hands. But in that fading light, I saw something carved into the cave wall beside me. Symbols that looked Native American, along with what might have been a warning written in multiple languages. One phrase was in English: "The hungry dead cannot cross running water." The creek. If I could reach the creek outside, maybe I'd be safe. But that meant leaving my hiding place, and the thing was still hunting. I waited until the singing seemed to come from the far end of the cave system, then slipped out of the crevice and began feeling my way back toward the entrance. Every step seemed to echo like a gunshot in the darkness. Every breath sounded like a windstorm. I was almost to the cave mouth when I heard movement behind me. Fast, predatory movement that spoke of something with too many joints moving in ways that human bodies couldn't. I stumbled into the gray pre-dawn light and ran for the creek, my dying flashlight barely showing me the way. The thing burst out of the cave behind me just as I reached the water. In the dim light, I could see what it really was now. A twisted amalgamation of Sarah and something else, something ancient and starving. It was 8 feet tall, with arms that hung down to its knees and a face that was a horrible parody of human features stretched over a skull that was too long and too narrow. But when it reached the edge of the creek, it stopped. It paced back and forth along the bank, snarling and reaching toward me with claws that could easily span my rib cage. But it wouldn't cross the water. "This won't last forever, Michael," it said in Sarah's voice. "Water freezes, creeks dry up. I can wait. I have all the time in the world, and you have maybe a day before the cold kills you." It was right. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I was already soaked to the skin. I needed shelter, warmth, food, but I also needed to put distance between myself and the creature. I followed the creek downstream for miles, staying in the water even as hypothermia began to set in. My legs went numb first, then my hands, then my core temperature began to drop. But behind me, I could hear the thing following along the bank, keeping pace, waiting for me to weaken enough to risk leaving the water. The creek eventually joined a larger stream, which joined a river, which led me, half dead from cold and exhaustion, to a road. The first car I flagged down was a DNR officer doing early morning rounds. He took one look at me and called for an ambulance. They found our campsite 3 days later. The official report lists it as an animal attack, probably a bear that had been feeding on carrion and had developed aggressive behavior. Kevin's body was discovered in a ravine about 2 miles from where we'd been staying. The coroner said he'd been killed by massive trauma, probably from being thrown against rocks during the attack. Sarah's body was never found, but I know she's still out there, in those dark woods, waiting for the next group of hikers who venture too far from the marked trails. The doctors say I'll recover fully from the frostbite, that I'll regain full use of my left leg once the bones heal. They say the hallucinations were caused by hypothermia and trauma, that there's a perfectly rational explanation for everything I experienced. They're wrong. 2 weeks ago, I got a call on my cell phone. The number showed up as Sarah's, even though I know they never found her phone. When I answered, there was nothing but breathing for a long moment. Then, in a voice that was definitely Sarah's voice but wasn't Sarah, something whispered, "I'm still hungry, Michael, and winter's coming." I've changed my number 3 times since then. It doesn't matter. Every few days the calls come. Always the same message. Always that horrible hunger in the voice that used to comfort me when I was scared. I'm writing this as a warning to anyone planning to visit the Porcupine Mountains. Stay on the marked trails. Don't venture into the backcountry. Don't trust voices in the darkness, no matter how familiar they sound. And if you see a woman hiking alone, a woman who looks like she might once have been named Sarah Rodriguez, don't approach her. Don't offer help. Just run, and don't look back. Some hungers can never be satisfied. Some of the dead don't stay dead. And some friends aren't friends anymore. The doctors say I should try to put this behind me, that dwelling on trauma isn't healthy. But every night when I close my eyes, I'm back in those woods. I can smell that sickly sweet rot, can hear that beautiful, terrible singing. And sometimes, just before I wake up, I can taste something copper in my mouth and feel an emptiness in my stomach that no amount of food seems to fill. I'm scared that whatever took Sarah is taking me too, slowly, piece by piece. I'm scared that one day I'll wake up and the hunger will be stronger than my humanity. I'm scared that I'll understand why the singing sounds so beautiful. God help me, I'm scared that I'm already starting to understand. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Ottawa National Forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my coworkers. I work in IT for a mid-sized insurance company in Grand Rapids, and every year our department does a team-building retreat. This year, our supervisor Jennifer Brown suggested we try something different from the usual corporate lodge nonsense: actual wilderness camping. I should have known better. I should have listened to that cold knot in my stomach when she first mentioned the Ottawa National Forest, specifically the remote area near Sturgeon Falls, miles from any real civilization. But Jennifer had this way of making you feel foolish for hesitating, and I'd been dealing with enough anxiety at work lately. My divorce had been finalized 6 months prior, and I was desperately trying to prove to myself and everyone else that I was still the same reliable Michael Williams who could handle anything. The other two who signed up were David Martinez from accounting, a quiet guy in his late 20s who always seemed to be watching people, calculating something behind his dark eyes, and Sarah Thompson from claims processing. Sarah was probably the most outdoorsy among us, having grown up in rural Minnesota before moving to Michigan for college. She'd been the one to research the specific location, finding what she called the perfect spot for getting away from everything. That phrase would haunt me later. We left Grand Rapids on a Friday afternoon in early October, when the Upper Peninsula's forests were ablaze with autumn colors. The drive took us nearly 6 hours, winding through increasingly remote roads until we reached the Sturgeon Falls area. The final 20 miles were on gravel Forest Service roads that seemed to stretch endlessly through towering pines and maples. Our cell phone signals had died an hour earlier, but Sarah assured us that was normal for this remote area. The campsite she'd selected was about 2 miles from the nearest marked trail, accessible only by a barely visible deer path that wound through dense undergrowth. She'd been here once before, she said, during a solo backpacking trip the previous summer. She described it as a small clearing beside a stream, completely private and peaceful. When we finally reached it just before sunset, I had to admit it was beautiful. The clearing was roughly 50 feet across, surrounded by towering white pines and maples that formed an almost perfect circle. A narrow stream gurgled along one edge, the water so clear you could see smooth stones on the bottom. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and pine needles. But something felt wrong from the moment we stepped into that clearing. I couldn't put my finger on it initially. The logical part of my mind dismissed it as typical anxiety. I'd been dealing with panic attacks since the divorce, and being in an unfamiliar wilderness environment was bound to trigger some unease. But this felt different, deeper, like the forest itself was watching us, waiting for something. David felt it too. I caught him scanning the tree line repeatedly as we set up camp, his movements quick and nervous. When I asked if everything was okay, he just shrugged and said the place felt heavy. Sarah laughed it off, calling us city boys who weren't used to real wilderness, but I noticed she positioned her tent closest to the stream, as if wanting an escape route. Jennifer, ever the leader, organized our camp with military precision. She'd brought a large 4-person tent for herself and Sarah, while David and I had smaller individual tents. The fire ring was positioned in the center of the clearing, with our tents arranged around it like the points of a compass. By the time full darkness fell, we had a good fire going and were settling in with instant camping food and beer David had smuggled in his pack. That first night, the wrongness was subtle. Little things that you might dismiss individually but which collectively created an atmosphere of creeping unease. The fire kept wanting to die down, no matter how much dry wood we added. The flames burned an odd color, more orange than normal, with occasional flickers of green that David swore he saw but the rest of us missed. Our food tasted off, not spoiled but somehow metallic, as if the very air was contaminating it. The sounds were wrong too. We were deep in old-growth forest that should have been alive with night sounds. Owls, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush. Instead, there was an oppressive silence broken only by our own voices and the crackling of the fire. Even the stream seemed muted, its babbling reduced to an almost inaudible whisper. "Listen," Sarah said suddenly, around 9 o'clock. We all fell silent, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest came a sound that made my skin crawl. A low, drawn-out moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before fading away. "Just a tree branch rubbing in the wind," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. "There's no wind," David pointed out. And he was right. The air was completely still. So still that our fire burned straight up without the slightest flicker. The moan came again, closer this time, and distinctly not the sound of any tree. It was organic, alive, filled with a hunger that seemed to seep into my bones. This time it was followed by what sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling our camp just outside the reach of the firelight. We all grabbed flashlights and swept the beam around the perimeter of the clearing. Nothing. Just the black wall of forest, impenetrable and somehow hostile. But I could swear I saw movement between the trees, shadows that shifted independently of our lights, always just at the edge of perception. "Probably just a bear," Sarah said, but she moved closer to the fire. "Bears don't sound like that," David replied quietly. He'd pulled out his phone and was staring at the screen with a frown. "This is weird. My GPS is showing us as being about 20 miles from where we actually are. And look at this." He held up his phone, showing the screen. The GPS map was flickering, our location jumping randomly across different parts of the forest. I checked my own phone. Same thing. The GPS showed us in at least 3 different locations, none of which matched where I knew we actually were. The map itself seemed wrong, too. Streams and trails that didn't match what we'd seen during our hike-in. "Electronics malfunction," Jennifer said dismissively. "Happens all the time in remote areas. Something about magnetic fields in the rocks." But I could see she was unsettled. We all were. The combination of the sounds, the GPS glitches, and that overwhelming sense of being watched was getting to us. By 10 o'clock, we'd decided to call it a night, though none of us wanted to admit we were too scared to stay up around the fire. I lay in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, listening to the unnatural silence. Occasionally, I'd hear that moaning sound again, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always from a different direction. My tent faced the fire, and I could see its glow through the thin nylon walls. Several times I was sure I saw shadows moving between the tents. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. Around what I guessed was 2 in the morning, I heard Jennifer scream. I was out of my sleeping bag and unzipping my tent flap before I was fully awake. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by. Jennifer was sitting up in her tent, pointing toward the forest. "Something was touching my tent," she said, her voice shaking. "Something was pressing against the wall, right next to my head. I could hear breathing." We all gathered around the dying fire, flashlights in hand, scanning the darkness. David added more wood and got the flames built back up. In the improved light, we could see impressions in the soft earth around Jennifer's tent. Large, deep prints that didn't look quite human. The toes were too long, and there were what looked like claw marks at the tips. "We should leave," David said quietly. "First thing in the morning, we pack up and get out of here." "Don't be ridiculous," Jennifer replied, but she was clearly shaken. "It's just some kind of animal. We'll keep the fire burning and take watches." Sarah agreed with Jennifer, though I could see doubt in her eyes. She kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. We arranged a watch schedule, 2 hours each, always keeping the fire bright. David volunteered for the first watch from 2 to 4 a.m. I tried to sleep, but couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. Every sound seemed amplified. David shifting by the fire, the pop and crackle of burning wood, the almost silent whisper of the stream. And underneath it all, that sense of presence, of being observed by something that meant us harm. I must have dozed off despite my anxiety, because the next thing I knew, Sarah was shaking me awake. Gray dawn light was filtering through the trees, and the fire had burned down to cold ashes. "Where's David?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. I sat up, immediately alert. David's tent was empty, the flap hanging open. His sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, as if he'd gotten up and walked out on his own. But his boots were still by his tent, and his jacket was hanging on a branch where he'd left it the night before. "David," Jennifer called out, her voice echoing strangely in the still air. "David, where are you?" No response. We searched the immediate area around the camp, calling his name and following what looked like bare footprints leading toward the stream. The tracks disappeared at the water's edge, as if he'd simply vanished. His flashlight was lying on the bank, the lens cracked and the bulb dead. "He probably just went to relieve himself and got disoriented in the dark," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. We all knew David was too careful, too methodical to wander off barefoot in the middle of the night without his flashlight. We spent the morning searching, expanding our search pattern in increasingly wide circles around the camp. The forest seemed different in daylight, less overtly threatening but somehow more wrong. The trees were too uniform, all exactly the same height. The undergrowth grew in perfect geometric patterns. Most disturbing of all, we couldn't find the deer path we'd followed to reach the clearing. It simply wasn't there anymore, as if it had never existed. Our GPS devices were completely useless now, showing us as being anywhere from northern Canada to the southern United States. Compasses spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. We tried retracing our steps from memory, but the forest seemed to have rearranged itself. Landmarks we remembered were gone, replaced by identical stands of pine and maple. By noon, we were forced to admit we were lost. Not just David, all of us. The clearing that was supposed to be our campsite was now impossible to find our way out of. Every direction looked the same. Every trail we tried led us in circles back to where we started. "This is impossible," Sarah said, staring at her compass as the needle spun aimlessly. "Forests don't just change overnight. Trails don't disappear." But Jennifer was still focused on finding David. She insisted we continue searching, convinced he was somewhere nearby, possibly injured and unable to call for help. So we spent the afternoon combing through the woods, shouting his name until our voices were hoarse. As evening approached, we reluctantly returned to the clearing to rebuild our fire and figure out our next move. That's when we found David's backpack hanging from a tree branch about 15 feet off the ground, suspended by what looked like twisted vines or rope. It hadn't been there that morning. We would have noticed it immediately. "How the hell did that get up there?" Sarah asked, staring up at the pack. "David must have climbed up and hung it there," Jennifer said, but she sounded uncertain. "Maybe he was trying to keep it away from animals." The pack was too high for any of us to reach, even standing on each other's shoulders. We tried throwing rocks to knock it down, but the branch was thick and the pack seemed to be secured too well. Eventually we gave up, adding this to the growing list of things that made no sense. That second night was worse than the first. The moaning sounds started earlier and came from multiple directions, as if we were surrounded by whatever was making them. The fire fought us constantly, requiring almost continuous attention to keep it burning. Our food had started to rot, despite being in sealed containers that had been fine the day before. Everything tasted of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. We tried to stay awake in shifts again, but exhaustion was taking its toll. I was on watch from midnight to 2 a.m. when I saw David walking into the clearing. At first, relief flooded through me. He emerged from the tree line slowly, moving with his characteristic, careful gait. He was fully dressed, boots, jacket, everything that had been left behind at his tent. In the firelight, he looked completely normal. "David," I called out, loud enough to wake the others. "Thank God. Where have you been? We've been searching for you all day." He didn't respond immediately, just stood at the edge of the firelight, perfectly still, staring at me. As Jennifer and Sarah crawled out of their tent, I got a better look at him, and something cold settled in my stomach. David was smiling. Not his usual shy half-smile, but a wide grin that showed too many teeth. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's, and he was staring at me without blinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was David's voice, but somehow wrong. Too flat, too emotionless. "I got lost," he said, "but I found my way back." "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, approaching him cautiously. "You look different." "I'm fine," David replied, still staring directly at me. "Better than fine. I found something in the woods, something that helped me understand." "Understand what?" Jennifer asked. David's grin widened impossibly, stretching his face in ways that shouldn't have been possible. "How hungry I am." That's when I noticed his fingernails. They were longer than they had been, filed to sharp points, and there was something dark under them, something that looked like dried blood. "David," I said carefully, reaching for the hunting knife I'd clipped to my belt, "why don't you sit down by the fire? You must be tired." He tilted his head to one side, still smiling that horrible smile. "I'm not tired, Michael. I'm hungry, and you all smell so delicious." Sarah stumbled backward, finally sensing the danger. Jennifer was slower to react, still trying to rationalize what she was seeing. That hesitation nearly cost her life. David moved faster than any human should be able to move. One moment he was standing at the edge of the clearing. The next he was lunging toward Jennifer with his hands extended like claws. I managed to tackle him from the side, sending all three of us sprawling near the fire. Up close, the wrongness was overwhelming. David's skin was cold as ice, and his breath smelled like rotting meat. When he opened his mouth to snarl at me, I saw that his teeth had changed. Longer, sharper, designed for tearing flesh. His eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. This wasn't David anymore. This was something else wearing his body like a mask. We fought beside the fire, rolling over hot coals and scattered logs. Whatever David had become was incredibly strong, but it seemed unused to its new body, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. I managed to pin its arms for a moment, long enough to shout at Jennifer and Sarah, "Run! Get to the stream!" But there was nowhere to run. We were trapped in the clearing, surrounded by dark forest that had already claimed David and seemed determined to claim the rest of us. The thing that wore David's face threw me off with inhuman strength, sending me sliding across the dirt. It turned toward Sarah, who was backing away with a thick branch held in front of her like a weapon. "You can't run from the hunger," it said in David's voice. "The forest feeds, and we are the feast." Jennifer finally snapped out of her shock and grabbed a burning branch from the fire. When she swung it at the David thing, it recoiled with a shriek that sounded like tearing metal. For a moment, it looked almost human again, confusion and pain flickering across its features. "David," Jennifer said hopefully. "David, are you in there?" The thing's head snapped toward her with an audible crack, neck twisted at an impossible angle. When it spoke, its voice was layered. David's voice overlaid with something else, something ancient and hungry. David is feeding the trees now. His bones make them grow stronger. His flesh feeds the roots. Soon you will join him. That's when Sarah screamed. She was pointing past the David thing, toward the edge of the clearing. More figures were emerging from the forest, pale, emaciated shapes that moved with the same jerky, unnatural gait. Some looked recent, still wearing the tattered remains of hiking clothes. Others appeared to have been absorbed by the forest itself, with bark growing through their skin and moss covering their faces. The clearing filled with the sound of dozens of voices speaking in unison. "The forest feeds, and we are the feast." I grabbed Jennifer's arm and pulled her toward the stream. It was our only chance. Whatever these things were, they seemed reluctant to cross running water. Sarah was already there, standing knee-deep in the cold stream with her branch held high. The David thing followed us, but it stopped at the water's edge, snarling and pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The other figures formed a semicircle behind it, all of them staring at us with those terrible black eyes. "What do they want?" Jennifer whispered. To feed, Sarah replied grimly. Look at them. They're starving. She was right. All of the figures were emaciated to the point of being skeletal, their clothes hanging off bones that showed clearly through translucent skin. But their bellies were distended, as if they were pregnant or had swallowed something large and round. As I watched, one of the older figures, wearing what looked like a ranger's uniform from decades past, opened its mouth impossibly wide. Something moved inside, pressing against the skin of its throat. Tree roots, I realized with horror. The things weren't just hungry for flesh, they were being consumed from within by the forest itself. The curse of the Wendigo, Sarah said quietly. My grandmother told me stories about places like this. Places where the forest turns hungry, where people go missing and come back wrong. Wendigo? Jennifer asked. Cannibalistic spirits. They possess people who resort to eating human flesh, but they're never satisfied. Always hungry, always seeking more meat. Sarah kept her eyes on the circling figures. But this is worse. This is a whole forest infected with that hunger. The David thing spoke again, its voice now completely inhuman. Join us willingly, and the change will be gentle. Fight, and we will take you piece by piece. How do we get out of here? I asked Sarah, hoping her knowledge of folklore might save us. Fire, she said immediately. They're afraid of fire, but we need to reach the true edge of the forest, not just the boundary of this cursed area. Looking around, I realized she was right. The clearing wasn't a natural formation, it was a trap, designed to lure people in and keep them contained while the forest worked its terrible magic on them. The stream might offer temporary protection, but it wouldn't save us permanently. There, Jennifer pointed upstream where the water disappeared around a bend. If we follow the stream, it has to lead out of here eventually. It was our only chance. Moving carefully to avoid slipping on the smooth stones, we began wading upstream. The water was shockingly cold, numbing our legs within minutes. Behind us, the figures followed along the bank, pacing and snarling but unable to cross the flowing water. The stream led us through a landscape that became increasingly surreal. Trees grew in perfect geometric patterns, their trunks twisted into spiral shapes that hurt to look at. The canopy overhead formed a solid roof of interwoven branches, blocking out all natural light. Phosphorescent fungi growing on the bark provided the only illumination, casting everything in an eerie green glow. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when Sarah stumbled and fell face first into the water. When Jennifer and I pulled her up, her lips were blue with cold and she was shivering uncontrollably. Can't feel my legs, she stammered through chattering teeth. We were all suffering from hypothermia, but Sarah was the worst. We had to get out of the water soon or she would die from exposure. But the moment we climbed onto the bank, the figures would be able to reach us. That's when I noticed something ahead. A break in the canopy where actual moonlight was filtering through. Real moonlight, not the sick green glow of the fungus. It was still a quarter-mile away, but it looked like genuine forest, not this twisted nightmare version. Almost there, I told the others. Just a little further. But Sarah collapsed again, this time unable to get back up. Her skin was taking on a blue tinge, and her breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. Jennifer and I each took one of her arms and tried to drag her forward, but our own strength was failing. Behind us, the figures had grown bolder. Some were actually stepping into the shallow parts of the stream, hissing and steaming where the water touched them but pushing forward anyway. The hunger was overcoming their supernatural aversion to running water. "Leave me," Sarah whispered. "Get out and send help." "No," Jennifer said firmly. "We all get out, or none of us do." But I could see we weren't going to make it. The figures were gaining ground, and we were too weak from cold and exhaustion to carry Sarah much further. That's when I remembered the hunting knife on my belt. "Take her," I told Jennifer. "Keep going upstream. Don't stop no matter what you hear." "Michael, no. Just go." I turned to face the approaching figures, pulling out the knife. It wasn't much against supernatural creatures, but it was all I had. The David thing was in the lead, its twisted face showing what might have been amusement. "Brave little morsel," it said. "Your sacrifice will make the meat taste sweeter." I lunged at it with the knife, aiming for what I hoped was still a vital area. The blade sank deep into its chest, black fluid spurting out instead of blood. The thing screamed, a sound like breaking glass, and staggered backward. But it didn't die. Instead, it grabbed my wrist and twisted until I heard bones crack. The knife fell from my nerveless fingers, splashing into the stream. The David thing's other hand closed around my throat, lifting me off my feet with impossible strength. "Now you feed the forest," it hissed. That's when Jennifer hit it from behind with a flaming branch she'd somehow kept burning. The thing's clothing caught fire immediately, and it released me to claw at the spreading flames. I collapsed into the stream, gasping and clutching my broken wrist. "Come on!" Jennifer shouted, pulling me to my feet. We stumbled upstream together, Sarah supported between us as the David thing's screams echoed through the twisted forest. Behind us, the other figures seemed confused by their leader's distress, milling around uncertainly instead of pursuing. The break in the canopy was closer now, maybe 100 yards away. Real moonlight, real forest, real escape. We pushed forward through sheer willpower, our legs barely functional from the cold water and exhaustion. 50 yards, 25, 10. And then we were through, stumbling out of the stream onto a muddy bank that felt like the most beautiful place on earth. Real trees, normal trees, stood around us. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on us in that cursed clearing was gone. Our phones immediately began picking up faint signals. We'd made it. We'd escaped. But as we helped each other up the bank toward what looked like a Forest Service road, I looked back at the stream. The David thing stood at the edge of the twisted forest, no longer on fire but horribly burned. It was staring directly at me with those black, hungry eyes. And it was smiling. "This isn't over," it called out, its voice carrying clearly across the water. "The forest has tasted you now. It knows your scent. Wherever you go, wherever you hide, the hunger will find you." We ran then, stumbling and falling but never stopping until we reached the Forest Service road. A ranger station was visible in the distance, its lights like beacons of salvation. We made it there just as dawn was breaking. 3 exhausted, hypothermic people with a story no one would believe. The rangers searched the Ottawa National Forest for David, but they never found any trace of him. The clearing where we'd camped couldn't be located, despite our detailed descriptions and GPS coordinates. According to the official report, we'd somehow gotten lost and disoriented, and David had wandered off during the night, probably falling into one of the deep ravines that crisscross the area. Jennifer quit her job 2 weeks later and moved to California. Sarah transferred to the company's Minnesota office, saying she needed to be closer to family. We don't keep in touch, but sometimes I wonder if they're experiencing what I am. Because the David thing was right. The hunger has followed me. It started small, food that tasted wrong, a persistent feeling of being watched, shadows that moved independently of their sources. But it's gotten worse over the past 6 months. People I know have started disappearing, always during camping trips or hiking expeditions. They turn up days later with no memory of where they've been, but there's something different about them, something wrong behind their eyes. And I've been having dreams of that twisted forest, of the David thing and its promise that I would feed the trees. In the dreams, I'm back in that clearing, but this time I'm not trying to escape. This time I'm helping to set the trap for the next group of campers. Last week, I caught myself researching camping spots in remote areas, making lists of which coworkers might be interested in a weekend trip, planning routes that would take us far from cell towers and main roads. The hunger is inside me now, growing stronger every day. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood, calling me back to that cursed place. And the worst part is that I want to go. I want to feel that terrible power, to join the David thing and all the others who feed the forest. I'm writing this as a warning, though I doubt anyone will believe it. Stay away from the Ottawa National Forest. Stay away from any place that feels too quiet, too perfect, too isolated. And if someone you know goes missing on a camping trip and comes back different, don't trust them. Don't let them get close, because the forest is always hungry and it's looking for new recruits to help it feed. The David thing was right about one other thing too. Wherever I go, wherever I hide, the hunger will find me. And soon I'm going to stop hiding. I can feel myself changing, piece by piece, thought by thought. My fingernails are growing longer. My teeth feel sharp against my tongue. And when I look in the mirror, sometimes my eyes flash black for just a moment before returning to normal. I don't know how much time I have left before I become like David, like all the others. But I know I need to get back to that forest soon. The hunger is calling, and it's getting harder to resist. If you're reading this and I'm no longer myself, please remember, the forest feeds and we are the feast. And now, so are you. The transformation is almost complete. I can feel the bark beginning to grow beneath my skin. My name is Kevin King, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, in the Hiawatha National Forest, where the ancient pines grow so thick that noon feels like twilight and the silence can drive you mad. I should have listened to the ranger at the Munising station when he warned us about the pictured rocks backcountry. The way his weathered face grew pale when I mentioned we were heading to the abandoned logging camp near Chapel Lake, how his fingers drummed nervously against his desk as he muttered something about bad winter up there and things that shouldn't be walking around. But my friends and I were young, cocky, and desperate to prove ourselves after our disastrous attempt at Sleeping Bear Dunes the previous summer. There were 4 of us: myself, my college roommate Daniel Lopez, his girlfriend Amanda Wright, and her cousin Sarah Rodriguez, who'd driven up from Grand Rapids. We'd planned this trip for months, poring over topographical maps and planning our route through some of the most isolated terrain in Michigan. The plan was simple: 5 days of wilderness camping, fishing Chapel Lake, and exploring the ruins of the old Seney Lumber Company that had been abandoned since the 1920s. Daniel was the outdoor enthusiast among us, always talking about getting back to nature and disconnecting from the digital world. He had expensive gear and an Instagram account dedicated to wilderness photography that he was always trying to feed with increasingly remote locations. Amanda was more reluctant but went along because she adored Daniel, while Sarah seemed genuinely excited about the adventure. As for me, I was just looking forward to a break from my soul-crushing job at a Detroit insurance firm. We drove up on a gray October morning, the trees already stripped bare by an unusually early winter. The temperature had been dropping steadily for weeks, and there was talk of the earliest snowfall on record. Even the locals in Munising seemed on edge, gathering in small groups and speaking in hushed tones about livestock found torn apart in ways that didn't match any known predator. The trailhead was a barely visible gap in the trees off Forest Road 13, marked only by a rusted metal sign riddled with bullet holes. We shouldered our packs and headed into the wilderness, following what remained of an old logging road that had been reclaimed by decades of undergrowth. Daniel led the way with his GPS unit, while I brought up the rear with the paper maps as backup. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfect. The autumn air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the distant sound of running water. We made good time, reaching the first checkpoint at Beaver Creek by early afternoon. The old wooden bridge had collapsed years ago, forcing us to wade across the icy water that numbed our feet even through waterproof boots. It was Sarah who first noticed something was wrong. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" she asked as we stopped for a water break on the far side of the creek. She was scanning the tree line with nervous eyes, her long black hair whipping in the wind. Daniel laughed it off. "It's just the wilderness, Sarah. You'll get used to it. There's always that feeling when you're this far from civilization." But I felt it too. A prickling sensation between my shoulder blades, as if something large and patient was observing us from the shadows between the trees. The forest seemed too quiet, lacking the usual sounds of birds and small animals. Even the wind made no noise as it passed through the bare branches above us. We pressed on, following the faint trail deeper into the backcountry. The old logging road became increasingly difficult to follow, often disappearing entirely for stretches where fallen trees and thick undergrowth had reclaimed the path. Daniel's GPS began acting strangely around mile marker 4, the screen flickering between coordinates and occasionally showing us as being in the middle of Lake Superior. "Probably just interference from the canopy," Daniel muttered, slapping the device against his palm. "These things aren't perfect." By late afternoon, we reached what remained of the Seney Lumber Company camp. It was more extensive than I'd expected, the foundations of at least a dozen buildings scattered across a clearing that nature was slowly reclaiming. The main lodge was still partially standing, its roof collapsed but the log walls mostly intact. Rusted machinery lay scattered throughout the site like the bones of some enormous creature. "This place gives me the creeps," Amanda said, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. She was a petite woman with short blonde hair and an expressive face that currently showed nothing but unease. "Can we camp somewhere else?" But Daniel was already in photographer mode, pulling out his camera and snapping shots of the ruins in the fading light. "Are you kidding? This is perfect. Look at that mist coming off the lake. We'll get incredible sunrise shots tomorrow." We set up camp in what had once been the mess hall, the partial roof providing some protection from the wind. As darkness fell, we built a fire in the old stone fireplace and heated up our freeze-dried meals. The flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and every few minutes something would creak or settle in the ruins around us. "So, what exactly happened here?" Sarah asked, stirring her beef stew. "Why did they abandon this place?" I'd done some research before the trip. The lumber company went under during the Depression, lost their contracts when the economy crashed, but there were stories. I hesitated, suddenly reluctant to continue. "What kind of stories?" Amanda pressed. "Workers started disappearing in the winter of 1929. First one, then another, then whole crews. They'd go out in the morning and never come back. Search parties found traces, torn clothing, blood, but no bodies. The company brought in investigators, even the state police, but they never found anything." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Let me guess. Local folklore blamed it on the mysterious creature of the woods." "Actually, yeah. The Ojibwe who worked at the camp called it Wendigo, said it was drawn by the scent of desperation and hunger that hung over the place as the company started failing." "Great bedtime story, Kevin," Amanda said dryly. "Remind me to thank you when I can't sleep tonight." But Sarah was listening intently. "What does a Wendigo look like?" "Depends on who you ask. Most descriptions say it's tall, emaciated, with yellowed fangs and eyes like holes burned in snow. Some say it was once human, transformed by cannibalism and eternal hunger into something that can never be satisfied." The fire popped loudly, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness, and we all jumped. Then we laughed at ourselves, but it was nervous laughter that died quickly in the oppressive silence of the ruins. We decided to turn in early, exhausted from the long hike. Daniel and Amanda shared one tent while Sarah and I took separate ones, arranged in a rough circle around the dying fire. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the night sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through dead leaves, and underneath it all, a sound I couldn't quite identify, a rhythmic scraping, like something large dragging itself across the forest floor. I must have dozed off because I woke to Sarah screaming. I unzipped my tent and stumbled out into a world transformed. A thick fog had rolled in from the lake, so dense I could barely see the glowing embers of our fire just a few feet away. Sarah's tent was empty, the zipper opened from the inside. "Sarah!" I called out, my voice muffled by the fog. "Where are you?" Her scream came again from somewhere in the direction of the lake, but it sounded wrong. Too high, too prolonged, fading into something that might have been laughter. Daniel emerged from his tent, flashlight in hand. "What's happening?" Where's Sarah?" "I don't know. She was screaming, but now—" I strained to listen, but heard only the thick silence of the fog. Amanda joined us, shivering in her pajamas. "Maybe she got disoriented going to the bathroom? People can get lost really easily in fog like this." We called her name repeatedly, our voices echoing strangely in the mist. Then Daniel's flashlight beam caught something that made my blood freeze. Footprints in the soft earth near Sarah's tent, but they weren't human. They were enormous, at least 15 inches long, with what looked like claw marks extending beyond the toe impressions. "What the hell made those?" Amanda whispered. Before anyone could answer, Sarah's voice drifted out of the fog, singing softly. It was a children's lullaby, something about hush-a-bye baby, but the melody was wrong, too slow, with notes that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. "Sarah," Daniel called. "Come back to camp. It's not safe out there." The singing stopped abruptly, followed by a sound that raised every hair on my body. A wet, ripping noise like fabric being torn, accompanied by a satisfied sigh. "We need to find her," Amanda said, but her voice shook with terror. Daniel nodded grimly and started toward the lake, following the massive tracks. I grabbed my own flashlight and fell in behind him, with Amanda bringing up the rear. The fog seemed to press against us like a living thing, cold and clammy against our skin. Our lights barely penetrated more than a few feet ahead. We found Sarah at the lake's edge, standing knee-deep in the water with her back to us. She was completely naked, her clothes scattered on the shore in shredded pieces. Her long hair hung down her back in wet tangles, and she was making a low, humming sound. "Sarah?" Amanda called softly. "Are you okay?" Sarah turned around slowly, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. Her eyes were black from lid to lid, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, like holes leading into endless darkness. Her mouth was stretched in a too-wide smile that revealed teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "I'm wonderful," she said in a voice that sounded like Sarah but was somehow different. Older, hungrier. "The water is so warm. You should come in." "Sarah, you need to get out of there," Daniel said, taking a step forward. "You're going to freeze." "I'm not cold," Sarah replied, tilting her head at an unnatural angle. "I'm never going to be cold again. He promised me." "Who promised you?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. Sarah's smile grew wider. "The hungry one. He's been waiting so long, Kevin. Waiting for someone to understand. Do you want to understand?" That's when I saw them. More tracks leading from the forest to the water's edge, but these were human footprints. Sarah's footprints. And they were walking beside the massive clawed tracks, not running from them. "She went willingly," I whispered. Amanda grabbed my arm. "What are you talking about?" "Look at the tracks. She wasn't being chased. She was walking with it." Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He called to me in my dreams, showed me such beautiful things. The taste of living flesh, the satisfaction of feeding the eternal hunger. I understand now why the workers disappeared. They didn't die. They joined him." Daniel was backing away, pulling Amanda with him. "This isn't Sarah. This is hypothermia or shock or—" "This is hunger," Sarah interrupted. "The kind that can never be satisfied. The kind that makes you want to share it with everyone you love." She started walking toward us, water streaming from her pale skin. With each step, she seemed to grow taller, thinner, her limbs stretching in ways that human joints shouldn't allow. Her face was changing too, the bone structure shifting beneath the skin like something was trying to get out. We ran. Behind us, Sarah, or what had been Sarah, let out a howl that echoed across the lake and through the forest, a sound of pure predatory joy. It was answered by another howl from deeper in the woods, and then another, until the night was filled with a chorus of hungry voices. We crashed through the fog, flashlight beams swinging wildly as we searched for our camp. But the ruins looked different now, larger and more imposing, as if the years of decay had reversed themselves. The collapsed roof of the mess hall was intact, lamplight flickering in the windows. "This way," Daniel panted, leading us toward what he thought was our campsite. But when we reached it, our tents were gone. Instead, there were rough wooden bunks arranged along the walls, and the air smelled of unwashed bodies and cooking meat. "What the hell is happening?" Amanda sobbed. That's when I realized the truth that my rational mind had been fighting to deny. We're not in our time anymore. The fog, the feeling of being watched. We've slipped into something else. Something from when this place was alive. The door to the mess hall creaked open, and Sarah walked in. But she wasn't alone. Behind her came shapes that might once have been human, but hunger and winter and something unspeakable had transformed them into living scarecrows of yellowed bone and stretched skin. Their eyes were all black holes, their mouths filled with teeth like broken glass. "The Wendigo doesn't make people," Sarah said in her new, terrible voice. "It makes them hungry, so hungry that they'll do anything to feed. And once you start feeding, you can never stop." One of the creatures stepped forward, and I recognized the tattered remains of a 1920s work shirt. These were the missing lumberjacks, transformed by decades of endless hunger into something that was no longer human. "Run," I whispered to my friends. "Run, now." We bolted for the back window, crashing through the glass into the fog-shrouded night. Behind us, the mess hall erupted in howls and the sound of claws scraping against wood as our pursuers gave chase. The forest had become a maze of shadows and mist, paths appearing and disappearing as we stumbled through the undergrowth. My lungs burned from the cold air and branches tore at our clothes and skin. Amanda fell, crying out as she twisted her ankle, and Daniel stopped to help her. "Keep going," she gasped. "Don't stop for me." But Daniel wouldn't leave her. "We stick together. We're not leaving anyone behind." That's when the Wendigo found us. It stepped out of the fog like something from a nightmare made flesh. 15 feet tall, gaunt as a famine victim but radiating impossible strength. Its skin was pale as birch bark and stretched tight over bones that jutted at sharp angles. The face was the worst part. Human enough to be recognizable but wrong in every detail. The eyes were hollow pits that seemed to pull light into them, and the mouth was a gash filled with rows of yellowed fangs. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of winter wind through empty bones. "I have been so hungry," it said, "so hungry for so long. But now you've brought me fresh meat and a new daughter to join my family." It gestured to the circle of transformed lumberjacks that had surrounded us, and in the center stood Sarah, no longer recognizable as human. She was tall and thin as the others now, her black eyes fixed on us with predatory interest. "Choose," the Wendigo continued. "Join us willingly, and I will make the transformation quick. Resist, and I will make you watch as I devour your friends piece by piece, keeping you alive until the very end." Amanda was sobbing quietly, her injured ankle preventing any chance of escape. Daniel stood protectively in front of her, though what protection he could offer against these creatures was questionable. I felt the weight of our situation pressing down on me like a physical force. That's when I remembered the old ranger's words about things that shouldn't be walking around. And something else. A story my grandmother had told me about the Ojibwe hunters who'd once roamed these forests. They'd known how to deal with Wendigos, back when such knowledge mattered. "Fire," I whispered. "They're afraid of fire." I still had my lighter in my pocket, and my jacket was made of synthetic material that would burn quickly. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all we had left. "What are you doing?" Daniel hissed as I pulled out the lighter. "Creating a distraction. When I light myself up, you run. Get Amanda out of here." "Kevin, no." But I was already flicking the lighter, holding the flame to my jacket sleeve. The synthetic material caught immediately, flames racing up my arm. The Wendigos recoiled with inhuman shrieks, their black eyes reflecting the fire like mirrors. "Now!" I screamed. Daniel grabbed Amanda and they stumbled toward the tree line as I became a human torch, the flames spreading across my jacket and shirt. The pain was incredible, but it was nothing compared to the satisfaction of watching the Wendigos retreat, their howls of hunger replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. but Sarah stepped forward, seemingly unaffected by the flames. "Fire can't save you from family," she said, her voice carrying a note of sadness beneath the hunger. "And you are family now, Kevin. You all are." She reached for me with hands that had grown into claws, and I realized that my desperate gambit had failed. The fire was consuming my clothes and beginning to burn my skin, but Sarah and the Wendigo she'd become showed no fear. That's when the gunshot rang out. Sarah jerked backward, a hole appearing in her chest that leaked black fluid instead of blood. Behind her stood the ranger from Munising, holding what looked like an antique rifle with symbols carved into the wooden stock. "Iron bullets, blessed by the elders," he said grimly. "Some of us still remember the old ways." More rangers emerged from the fog, all armed with similar weapons. They formed a protective circle around us as the Wendigo and its transformed children retreated into the deeper shadows of the forest. "You should have listened when I warned you about the backcountry," the ranger said as his colleagues helped extinguish the flames on my burning clothes. "Every few years, someone gets curious about the old lumber camp. Most are smart enough to turn back when the wrongness starts, but there's always a few who push deeper." "Sarah," Amanda sobbed, staring at her cousin's body where it lay twisted in the fog. "She was gone the moment she answered its call," the ranger said sadly. "The hunger takes everything human and leaves only need behind. We've been tracking this particular Wendigo for decades, but it's clever, patient. It knows how to stay hidden until the right prey wanders into its territory." They helped us gather what remained of our gear and escorted us back to the trailhead. The fog lifted as we walked, revealing a normal autumn forest with no trace of the nightmare we'd experienced. But I could still feel those black eyes watching us from the shadows, and I knew that somewhere in the deep woods, the Wendigo was waiting for the next group of hikers to ignore the warnings and venture into its hunting ground. Daniel and Amanda never spoke about what happened that night. They moved to California within a month, as far from the Michigan wilderness as they could get. I tried to return to my normal life, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. Dreams of Sarah calling to me from the fog, promising that the hunger would make everything clear. It's been 3 months now, and I'm writing this from a cabin I rented near the pictured rocks. I keep telling myself I'm here to find closure, to prove that what happened was real and not some shared hallucination brought on by hypothermia and panic. But I know that's not the truth. The truth is that I can feel it calling to me, the same hunger that claimed Sarah. It whispers to me in the small hours of the morning, promising relief from the emptiness that's been growing inside me since that night. The ranger was wrong about one thing. The Wendigo doesn't just take the people who answer its call, it plants seeds in the ones who escape. I can feel those seeds growing now, sending roots deep into my soul. The constant gnawing sensation in my stomach that no amount of food can satisfy. The way normal life has started to seem gray and meaningless, while the forest calls to me with the promise of understanding. Tomorrow, I'm going back to the lumber camp. I've studied the maps, learned the old trails that the rangers don't patrol. Sarah is waiting for me there, I know it. She'll help me understand what I'm becoming, what I've always been meant to become. The hunger is so beautiful when you stop fighting it, so pure, so eternal. If anyone finds this journal, don't come looking for me. Don't try to save me. I don't want to be saved anymore. I want to join my family in the deep woods, where the mist never lifts and the feast never ends. The Wendigo was right about one thing. We are all family now, and family should never go hungry. My name is James Anderson, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Ottawa National Forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in October of last year. I still wake up screaming sometimes, clawing at my sheets, feeling phantom frost burning my fingertips and hearing that goddamn whistling carried on wind that doesn't exist. Michael Williams had been my best friend since college. We'd maintained our friendship through job changes, relationships, and the general drift that pulls people apart after graduation. Mike was the type who could find humor in a funeral and make you laugh despite yourself. He had this infectious optimism that made even the most miserable camping trip feel like an adventure. That's probably why I agreed to his crazy idea in the first place. "Come on, James," he'd said over beers at Murphy's Tavern back in September. "When's the last time we did something real? Something that didn't involve staring at screens all day?" I'd been working 60-hour weeks at the accounting firm, buried in spreadsheets and quarterly reports. The idea of escaping into the wilderness for a long weekend sounded like exactly what I needed. Mike had found what he called the perfect spot, a remote area in the Ottawa National Forest near the old Sturgeon River Gorge. According to him, there were backcountry campsites that most tourists never found, places where you could go days without seeing another soul. Total digital detox, he'd promised. No cell service, no emails, no bullshit. Just us, the woods, and some quality bonding time with nature. I should have known something was off when Mike insisted we leave on a Thursday afternoon instead of Friday. He'd taken a half-day off work, something he never did, and seemed almost manic in his enthusiasm. When I picked him up at his apartment, he was waiting on the curb with his gear, bouncing on his heels like a kid on Christmas morning. "You're way too excited about sleeping on the ground and eating trail mix," I joked as he threw his backpack in my Jeep. "Trust me," he'd said, grinning. "This is going to be exactly what we both need." The drive north took us through increasingly remote terrain. We passed through small towns with names like Watersmeet and Marinisco, places that looked like they'd been frozen in time since the 1950s. The further we went, the fewer cars we saw, until it felt like we were the only people left in the world. The trees grew denser, taller, pressing in on the narrow 2-lane road like they were trying to reclaim the asphalt. Mike navigated using an old paper map he'd picked up at a gas station, insisting that GPS couldn't be trusted in the deep woods. "Electronics fail up here," he'd said matter-of-factly. "Something about the mineral deposits in the soil." We turned off the main road onto a dirt track that seemed to lead nowhere. My Jeep bounced and lurched over ruts and fallen branches as we pushed deeper into the forest. The canopy overhead grew so thick that it felt like driving through a tunnel, with only occasional shafts of sunlight breaking through to dapple the forest floor. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked after we'd been driving for what felt like hours on increasingly primitive roads. "Positive," Mike said, though I noticed he was gripping the map tighter than necessary. "Just a little further." The road eventually petered out entirely at a small clearing barely large enough to park. According to Mike's map, we still had a 3-mile hike to reach the campsite he'd marked. I grabbed my pack and followed him into the woods, trying to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest was ancient. These weren't the neat rows of planted pines you'd find in managed woodlands, but old-growth forest that had stood for centuries. Massive white pines and hemlocks rose like cathedral pillars, their trunks so wide that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. The understory was surprisingly open, carpeted with decades of fallen needles that muffled our footsteps. But it was the silence that unnerved me most. In all my previous camping experiences, the woods had been alive with sound. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. Here, there was nothing. Even our own voices seemed to get swallowed by the trees before they could travel more than a few feet. "It's so quiet," I mentioned as we hiked along what Mike insisted was a trail, though it looked like little more than a deer path to me. "That's the point," he replied, but I caught him glancing over his shoulder as he said it. We'd been hiking for about an hour when we found the first one. I almost stepped on it before Mike grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. At our feet lay the remains of a deer, or what had been a deer. The bones were picked clean and arranged in a perfect circle, ribs pointing outward like the spokes of a wheel. In the center sat the skull, facing north, with what looked like symbols carved into the forehead. "Animals don't do that," I said, stating the obvious. Mike was already backing away, pulling me with him. "Come on, let's keep moving. Shouldn't we report this or something? This has to be some kind of sick ritual or—" "To who?" Mike snapped. "We're 40 miles from the nearest town, James. There's no cell service, no rangers, nobody. We deal with this ourselves or we don't deal with it at all." His reaction surprised me. The Mike I knew would have been fascinated by something like this, would have wanted to examine it, take pictures, maybe even call it in when we got back to civilization. This Mike seemed genuinely spooked, and that spooked me in turn. We gave the bone circle a wide berth and continued hiking. I kept looking back over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something was following us. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed to suggest hidden watchers in the trees. The campsite, when we finally reached it, was exactly as Mike had described. A small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream with a stone fire ring and a couple of old log benches. It was beautiful, peaceful, and completely isolated. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect, but I couldn't stop thinking about those bones. We set up camp in practiced silence. Mike and I had done this enough times that we fell into our usual routine. He gathered firewood while I pitched the tents and organized our gear. By the time the sun started to set, we had a decent camp established and a fire crackling in the ring. "See?" Mike said as we sat on the logs, sharing a bottle of bourbon and watching the flames dance. "This is exactly what we needed. No stress, no deadlines, no bullshit, just us and the wilderness." I nodded and took a swig from the bottle, feeling the whiskey burn away some of my unease. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just letting my imagination run wild. The bone circle was probably just some kids playing a prank, or maybe some New Age types doing a ceremony. Nothing to worry about. That's when we heard the whistling. It started low and soft, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. At first, I thought it was just wind in the trees, but then I realized there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, so still that the smoke from our fire rose straight up like a gray pillar. The whistling grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't random or natural. There was a melody to it, something haunting and discordant that made my teeth ache. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees like it was bouncing off the trunks themselves. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Mike had gone pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the bourbon bottle. "I don't know." The whistling continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself, heavy and expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. "Probably just someone else camping nearby," Mike said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. That didn't sound human. What else could it be? I didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't like the possibilities that were running through my head. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a while longer, starting at every small sound, before finally deciding to call it a night. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to Mike's breathing from the tent next to mine, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A branch creaking, leaves rustling, footsteps that might have been my imagination. At some point in the early morning hours, I must have finally fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, Mike was shaking me awake. James, wake up!" I sat up, disoriented. Pale morning light was filtering through the tent walls, and I could hear birds calling in the distance, normal forest sounds that had been absent the day before. "What time is it?" I mumbled. 7:30, but that's not— "James, look at this." I crawled out of my tent and immediately saw what had Mike so agitated. Our campfire, which we'd carefully banked the night before, was completely cold. Not just out, cold, as if it had been extinguished hours ago. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that it had been rebuilt. Where our simple fire had been, someone had constructed an elaborate structure. Logs were stacked in complex geometric patterns, forming what looked almost like a miniature log cabin. Stones from the stream had been arranged around it in precise spirals. And in the very center, balanced on a tiny pedestal of sticks, sat a small animal skull. "Did you do this?" Mike asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Are you insane? When would I have done this? You were 20 feet away all night." We both stood there staring at the impossible fire ring, neither of us wanting to voice what we were both thinking. Someone had been in our camp while we slept. Someone had dismantled our fire and rebuilt it into whatever this was, and we hadn't heard a thing. "We need to leave," I said. "Yeah," Mike agreed. "Yeah, we should probably head back." But as we started breaking down camp, we discovered another problem. Mike's backpack, which had been securely closed and hanging from a bear line, was missing. Not stolen. Missing. The rope was still there, still tied in the exact same knots, but the pack had simply vanished. "This is impossible," Mike kept saying as we searched the surrounding area. "Nobody could have untied that rope without cutting it, and even if they did, why would they take my pack but leave everything else?" We spent 2 hours combing through the woods around our campsite, but found no trace of the missing pack. Mike's sleeping bag, his food, his extra clothes, his water purification tablets, all gone. He was left with just the clothes on his back and whatever was in his pockets. "We can share my stuff," I told him, though I was already calculating whether my supplies would stretch to get us both back to the car. "We'll travel light and move fast." But when we tried to retrace our steps, we ran into another problem. The trail we'd followed in, the one Mike had been so confident about, was gone. Not overgrown or hard to follow, but completely absent. Where there had been a clear path the day before, now there was only unbroken forest. "This doesn't make sense," Mike said, studying his map with increasing desperation. "We came from that direction. I know we did. The stream was on our left. The big white pine was a landmark. But every direction looked the same. Ancient trees stretched away in all directions, creating a maze of shadows and identical clearings. The stream we'd camped beside seemed to branch and fork in ways that hadn't been apparent the day before, creating a confusing network of waterways that all looked exactly the same. We picked a direction and started walking, hoping to stumble across something familiar. But as the hours passed, I began to suspect we were walking in circles. The same fallen logs seemed to appear again and again. The same distinctive rock formation kept showing up in our path. "We're lost," I said finally. Mike stopped walking and sagged against a tree. No, we can't be lost. I mapped this whole route. I know exactly where we are." "Then where are we?" He stared at the map in his hands, turning it this way and that as if a different orientation might make everything click into place. I don't know." That's when I started to panic. Not the rational concern of experienced hikers who'd taken a wrong turn, but the deep, primal fear of prey animals who suddenly realize they're being hunted. Because that's what this felt like. Not an accident or a simple case of getting turned around, but something deliberate. Someone or something was playing with us. "The GPS," I said suddenly. "I've got a GPS unit in my pack." I dug through my gear until I found the device, a top-of-the-line unit I'd bought specifically for backcountry navigation. I switched it on and waited for it to acquire satellites. The screen flickered, showed a few promising bars, then went blank. "Battery's dead?" Mike asked. "No, it's fully charged. Look." I showed him the power indicator, which clearly showed a full battery, but every time I tried to turn the unit on, the screen would flicker and die. We were stranded, lost in the middle of thousands of acres of wilderness with no way to navigate and limited supplies. I tried to stay calm, to think logically about our situation, but my mind kept returning to that bone circle and the impossible reconstruction of our campfire. "We need to find water and shelter," I said. "Set up a base camp and figure out our next move." We had water. We had shelter. Someone took them. "Mike, you're not helping. We need to focus on—" "No, you focus." He wheeled around to face me, and I was shocked by how much he'd changed in just a few hours. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild and darting. "You focus on whatever rational explanation makes you feel better. But something is fucking with us, James. Something that doesn't want us to leave." I wanted to argue, to find some logical explanation for everything that had happened. But standing there in the endless cathedral of trees, With the silence pressing in on us like a living thing, I couldn't bring myself to disagree. We found another stream, or maybe the same stream. It was impossible to tell, and decided to follow it downstream, reasoning that water always led to civilization eventually. But as we walked, I started noticing things that made my skin crawl. Trees with claw marks scored deep into their bark, too high and too wide to have been made by any normal animal. Patches of ground where nothing grew, perfect circles of dead earth that felt cold even in the afternoon sun. And everywhere, that sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The worst part was the smell. It came and went like a phantom, carried on breezes that shouldn't have existed in the still air. It was the smell of rotting meat and wet fur, of things that should have been buried long ago. Sometimes it was so strong it made me gag, other times it was just a hint, a suggestion at the edge of perception. "Do you smell that?" I asked Mike during one particularly strong wave of the stench. "Smell what?" I stared at him. The odor was so powerful I could taste it, but he seemed genuinely oblivious. Either he was lying or something was very, very wrong. We kept walking until the sun started to set, then made camp in a small clearing beside the stream. Without Mike's pack, we had to share my single tent, a cramped two-person affair that barely held one person comfortably. As darkness fell, we huddled together like scared children, listening to the forest come alive around us. But these weren't the normal sounds of a woodland night. These were sounds I'd never heard before, deep, resonant calls that seemed to come from the earth itself, scraping and scuttling that suggested enormous things moving through the trees, and underneath it all, that goddamn whistling. "James," Mike whispered around midnight. "James, are you awake?" "Yeah." "I need to tell you something, about why I wanted to come here." I turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through the tent walls. His face was barely visible, but I could see his eyes, wide and frightened. "I've been having dreams," he continued, "for weeks now. The same dream, every night. I'm standing in a forest that looks exactly like this one, and there's something calling to me. Something that knows my name." "Mike, what the hell are you talking about?" "In the dream, I follow the voice deeper and deeper into the woods, until I come to a clearing. And in the clearing, there's something waiting for me. Something that looks like a person, but isn't. It's too tall, too thin, and its mouth..." He shuddered. "Its mouth is full of teeth that don't belong in any human skull." I felt ice forming in my stomach. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I thought they were just dreams. Stress from work, too many late nights, too much coffee. But when I found this place on the map, when I saw the name of the forest, I knew it was the same place. The place from my dreams." "So you brought us here anyway? Are you out of your fucking mind?" "I had to." His voice rose to just below a shout, then dropped back to a whisper. "Don't you understand? The dreams weren't stopping. They were getting stronger, more real. I thought if I came here, if I faced whatever was calling to me, maybe they'd finally leave me alone." I stared at him in disbelief. My best friend, the person I'd trusted with my life, had deliberately led us into danger based on nightmares and delusions. I wanted to hit him, to scream at him, to demand that he find some way to get us out of this mess. But before I could say anything, we heard footsteps outside the tent. Not animal footsteps. Human footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our campsite like a predator sizing up its prey. We both froze, barely breathing, as the footsteps continued their circuit. Around and around our tent they went, sometimes pausing as if the walker was listening for sounds from inside. I gripped my flashlight in one hand and my camping knife in the other, though I doubted either would be much use against whatever was out there. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent entrance. We waited in terrified silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Mike couldn't take it anymore. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer, but I could hear breathing now, slow and deep, like someone savoring the scent of fear through the thin nylon walls. "We're armed," I added, though my voice cracked with terror. The breathing stopped. Then, impossibly, we heard a voice that sounded exactly like Mike's. "James? James, are you in there? I can't find the tent." I looked at Mike, who was staring back at me with his mouth open in shock. The voice came again, still perfectly mimicking Mike's tone and inflection. "I went to take a piss and got turned around. Everything looks the same in the dark. Can you turn on a light or something?" "That's not me," Mike whispered, barely audible. "James? Come on, man, this isn't funny. I'm getting freaked out here." I wanted to respond, to call out and tell whatever was mimicking my friend to go away. But some primitive instinct warned me that acknowledging the voice would be a mistake. Instead, I pressed my hand over Mike's mouth and shook my head. The fake Mike continued pleading for several more minutes, its voice growing increasingly desperate and panicked. But there was something wrong with it, something subtly off that made my skin crawl. The inflection was perfect, but there was no emotion behind it, no genuine fear or confusion. It was like listening to a recording or an actor reading lines. Finally, the voice stopped. The breathing resumed for a moment, then faded away as the footsteps circled the tent one more time and disappeared into the forest. Neither of us slept that night. We lay in our sleeping bags, knives in hand, listening to the alien sounds of the forest and jumping at every snap of a twig. When dawn finally came, we emerged from the tent to find our campfire rebuilt once again, this time in the shape of a perfect spiral, with small bones arranged at precise intervals along its curves. "We're leaving," I announced. "Right now. I don't care if we have to walk for 3 days straight." Mike nodded, but as he started packing his gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His movements were slow and mechanical, lacking the nervous energy that had characterized him since we'd gotten lost. And when he looked at me, there was something wrong with his eyes. They were too focused, too still, like he was looking through me rather than at me. "Mike? You okay?" "Fine," he said, but his voice had the same flat quality as the thing that had called to us in the night. I watched him carefully as we broke camp, noting the small changes in his behavior. He didn't complain about leaving his missing gear behind. He didn't suggest any plans for finding our way out. He just followed along behind me, silent and compliant, like a sleepwalker going through the motions of being awake. We walked for hours without finding any trace of the trail we'd lost. The forest seemed to shift around us, familiar landmarks appearing and disappearing like mirages. The stream we'd been following split and merged with itself in ways that defied geography, creating an ever-changing maze of waterways that led nowhere. I was starting to suspect that the forest itself was somehow alive, rearranging itself to keep us trapped, when Mike suddenly stopped walking. "This is it," he said. "This is what?" "The clearing. From my dreams." I looked around. We were standing at the edge of a perfectly circular clearing, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by the largest trees I'd ever seen. The ground was covered with strange symbols carved into the earth, spirals and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the very center of the clearing stood something that might have once been human. It was at least 8 feet tall, gaunt to the point of emaciation, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. Its skin was the color of old snow, stretched tight over bones that seemed too long and too sharp, but it was the face that made me want to run screaming back the way we'd come. The thing had Mike's face. Not similar to Mike's face, but exactly the same, down to the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. But the proportions were all wrong. The features stretched and distorted like a photograph printed on the wrong paper. And when it smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, I knew we were looking at the source of the voice that had called to us in the night. "Hello, James," it said in Mike's voice. "I've been waiting for you." I grabbed for Mike's arm, intending to drag him away from this nightmare, but he shrugged me off and stepped forward into the clearing. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting too." "Mike, what are you doing? Get away from that thing." But he wasn't listening. He walked straight toward the creature, his movements still mechanical and strange. When he reached the center of the clearing, the thing that wore his face reached out with one impossibly long arm and touched his forehead. Mike convulsed, his back arching as something dark and writhing passed between them. His eyes rolled back in his head, showing only white, and when they rolled forward again, they were different. Predatory. Hungry. "Thank you for bringing him to me," the creature said, still using Mike's voice but now speaking from Mike's mouth. "It's been so long since I've had a proper meal." I ran. I crashed through the forest like a madman, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my backpack bouncing against my spine with each desperate step. Behind me, I could hear laughter. Mike's laughter, but wrong, echoing through the trees like the howl of a wolf. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed meaningless in that place, stretching and contracting like taffy. The sun might have been setting or rising. I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had taken my friend. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I collapsed beside a fallen log, gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The forest around me was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This felt expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. "James." I spun around to find Mike standing 20 feet away, looking perfectly normal except for his eyes. Those predatory, hungry eyes that belonged to something else entirely. "Where are you going?" he asked, tilting his head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be human. "We're not done playing yet." I pulled out my knife, a pathetic 4-inch blade that wouldn't have intimidated a raccoon, let alone whatever was wearing my friend's skin. "Stay back," I warned. Mike, or the thing pretending to be Mike, laughed. "Oh, James, you still don't understand, do you? This isn't about you anymore. This is about hunger. And I haven't eaten in such a very, very long time." It started walking toward me, moving with that same mechanical gait I'd noticed earlier. But now I could see other changes too. Its limbs were slightly too long, its fingers ending in points that looked suspiciously like claws. Whatever process had begun in the clearing was continuing, transforming my friend into something monstrous. I backed away, keeping the knife between us, looking for somewhere to run. But the trees seemed to press closer with each step, creating a natural arena from which there was no escape. "I can smell your fear," the mic thing said conversationally. "It's delicious, like wine that's been aging for decades. What are you? What do you want?" "I am hunger given form. I am the cold that comes before the storm, the silence that follows the scream. Your kind have many names for me. Wendigo, Windigo, Witiko. But names are just sounds, aren't they? What matters is what I do." The creature that had been my friend lunged forward with inhuman speed. I slashed out with the knife, feeling it connect with something solid, and heard a shriek of rage and pain. Dark blood, too dark, almost black, spattered the forest floor. The wound slowed it down but didn't stop it. The thing circled me like a wolf, probing for weaknesses, testing my reflexes. Every few seconds it would dart forward, forcing me to defend myself, wearing me down with a predator's patience. "You can't run forever," it hissed, "and when you finally tire, when you finally fall, I'll peel the skin from your bones and feast on your terror." But as we danced our deadly circle, I noticed something. The wound I'd inflicted wasn't healing. If anything, it seemed to be spreading, dark veins of corruption radiating out from the gash. Whatever this thing was, it could be hurt. I feinted left, then rolled right as it lunged, slashing upward with the knife as it passed overhead. The blade caught it across the ribs, opening another wound that bled that same dark ichor. The creature shrieked again and stumbled, giving me the opening I needed. I ran, but this time with purpose. I'd noticed something during our fight, a faint trail through the trees, barely visible but definitely there. It might have been a game trail, or maybe the ghost of the path we'd lost. Either way, it was my only hope. The creature pursued me, crashing through the underbrush with increasingly clumsy movements. Whatever I'd done to it was taking effect, slowing it down, making it careless. I could hear it calling after me in Mike's voice, but the words were slurred now, barely intelligible. The trail led uphill, winding through increasingly sparse trees toward what I hoped was higher ground. If I could find a vantage point, maybe I could spot the road or some other landmark. Maybe I could find a way out of this nightmare. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. Either the creature was falling further behind, or it had given up the chase. I didn't slow down to find out which. The trees finally thinned, revealing a rocky outcropping that rose above the forest canopy. I scrambled up the loose stone, cutting my hands on the sharp edges, driven by desperation and the fading adrenaline of terror. At the top, I turned to look back the way I'd come. The forest stretched away in all directions, an unbroken sea of green that seemed to go on forever. But there, in the distance, I could see a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the trees. The road. It was at least 5 miles away, but it was there. I started down the other side of the outcropping, moving as quickly as I dared on the treacherous stone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of the dark blood I'd spilled. I needed to reach the road before full darkness fell. It took me 3 hours of stumbling through unfamiliar terrain to reach the asphalt. By then, my water was gone, my food was gone, and I was running on nothing but fear and determination. But I'd made it. I was back in the world of human things, away from the hungry silence of the deep woods. A trucker picked me up 20 minutes later, a gruff man in a flannel shirt who took one look at my condition and didn't ask too many questions. He drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police and tried to explain what had happened. They sent search teams into the forest, of course. I led them as close to the area as I could remember, though everything looked different in daylight. They found our abandoned Jeep right where we'd left it. They found the trail Mike and I had followed into the woods. They even found our first campsite with the remains of our fire ring and scattered gear. But they never found Mike. Not alive, anyway. 3 days into the search, they discovered something in a clearing about 2 miles from where I'd last seen him. The report described it as the partial remains of an adult male, though the condition of the body made positive identification impossible. The bones had been picked clean and arranged in a pattern the investigators couldn't identify. The skull was missing. They ruled it an animal attack, possibly by a bear or pack of wolves. The official report cited my obvious psychological trauma and exposure-induced hallucinations as explanations for the more outlandish elements of my story. They recommended counseling and suggested that I avoid camping alone in the future. I never told them about the dreams. They started 3 weeks after I got back, the same dreams Mike had described. I'm standing in a forest that looks exactly like the Ottawa National Forest, and there's something calling to me, something that knows my name. In the dream, I follow the voice deeper and deeper into the woods until I come to a clearing. And in the clearing, there's something waiting for me, something that looks like Mike but isn't quite right. It's too tall, too thin, and its mouth is full of teeth that don't belong in any human skull. "James," it says in Mike's voice, "I've been waiting for you." I wake up screaming every time, clawing at my sheets, feeling phantom frost burning my fingertips. But the dreams are getting stronger, more real. And I know, with the terrible certainty of prey recognizing its predator, that one day soon I'm going to stop waking up. One day soon, I'm going to follow that voice back into the forest, back to the clearing where something hungry waits in the darkness between the trees. Back to feed the thing that wears my dead friend's face and calls my name in his voice. The Wendigo is patient. It can wait, but not forever. My name is Michael Williams and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park, Michigan, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my college friends. We called ourselves the Weekend Warriors back then. 5 guys who met freshman year and somehow managed to stay close through careers, relationships, and the general chaos of approaching 30. There was Danny Rodriguez, our unofficial leader and the one who'd organized this trip. He worked in finance now, but still had that same infectious enthusiasm that made him impossible to say no to. Kevin Allen was our tech guy, always fiddling with some new gadget or GPS device. Brian Carter, built like a linebacker and twice as stubborn, worked construction and never met a physical challenge he wouldn't tackle head-on. And then there was Ryan Nelson, the quiet one among us, a graphic designer who observed everything but said little unless you really got him talking. I should have known something was wrong when Kevin's GPS started acting up on the drive-in. We were heading toward the Mirror Lake Trail, a moderate hike that should have taken us through old-growth forest to a backcountry campsite Danny had found online. The October air was crisp, leaves turning brilliant reds and golds, and the forecast called for perfect weather. Everything seemed ideal. Turn left in. Recalculating. Turn left in. Recalculating. Kevin's device kept repeating as we wound through the narrow forest roads leading into the park. "This thing's been doing this since we left Grand Rapids," Kevin muttered, tapping the screen with increasing frustration. "GPS is usually rock solid up here." Danny laughed from the driver's seat. "When has technology ever worked properly when you actually need it? That's why I printed out the trail maps as backup." We parked at what should have been the Mirror Lake trailhead, but the wooden sign was weathered beyond reading. The letters faded to illegible scratches. Brian shrugged it off. "State budget cuts. Probably haven't replaced these signs in years." The trail itself seemed clear enough, a well-worn path leading into dense hardwood forest. We shouldered our packs and set off in good spirits, joking about work, reminiscing about college mishaps, the usual rhythms of friendship that made these trips feel like stepping back in time. But something felt off from the start, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. The forest was too quiet. Not completely silent, there were birds calling and wind through the leaves, but missing something fundamental. It took me nearly an hour to realize what. No squirrel chatter, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzzing insects. Just the 5 of us and our footfalls on the packed earth. "Anyone else notice how clean this trail is?" Ryan finally voiced what had been nagging at me. "No fallen branches, no debris, like someone maintains it regularly." Kevin consulted his phone. No signal, not even one bar. That's weird. I had full coverage when we parked. "We're in the wilderness, man," Brian said, though he sounded less certain than usual. "What do you expect?" The first real sign that something was wrong came around noon when we stopped for lunch. Danny pulled out his printed trail map, spreading it across a fallen log while we ate our sandwiches. His confident expression slowly shifted to confusion, then concern. "This doesn't match," he said, tracing the route with his finger. "We should have hit 3 creek crossings by now, but we haven't seen any water, and there should be a scenic overlook about a quarter-mile back." We all gathered around the map. The trail we'd been following simply wasn't on it. According to Danny's carefully researched documentation, we should have been hiking parallel to Lake Superior by now, but we were clearly moving deeper into dense interior forest. "Maybe we took a wrong turn at that fork about an hour back," I suggested, though I didn't remember seeing any fork. "What fork?" Ryan asked quietly. A chill ran down my spine because Ryan was right. I couldn't actually recall any junction where we might have gone wrong. The trail had been remarkably straight and clear, almost impossibly so for a wilderness path. "Let's backtrack," Danny decided. "Retrace our steps until we figure out where we went off course." But when we turned around, the trail behind us looked different. Narrower somehow, with thick brush encroaching from both sides where I distinctly remembered walking through open forest. The path we'd just traveled looked like it hadn't been used in years. "This isn't right," Kevin said, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that comes from having all your technology fail at once. "This isn't the same trail." We pressed on anyway because what choice did we have? The alternative was admitting we were lost, and none of us were ready for that conversation yet. As the afternoon wore on, the wrongness became harder to ignore. The shadows fell at odd angles that didn't match the sun's position. Twice I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, something large keeping pace with us through the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The temperature began dropping faster than it should have. By 4 o'clock, our breath was visible in the air, though the weather report had called for mid-60s all day. "We need to find somewhere to camp," Danny announced, though his usual leadership confidence had developed a brittle edge. "Get a fire going before it gets too cold." We found a small clearing about 50 yards off the trail, relatively level ground with a ring of stones that someone had arranged for a fire pit. The setup looked old but serviceable, and we were grateful for anything that suggested previous human presence. Setting up camp should have been routine. We'd done this dozens of times over the years, but everything felt off-kilter. Tent stakes bent on what should have been soft forest floor. Sleeping bags that unrolled fine but somehow felt wrong when you got inside them, like the fabric had been stretched or twisted. The fire pit looked normal from a distance, but up close the stones had a strange, oily residue that left dark stains on our fingers. Brian got the fire started while the rest of us finished setting up. The flames burned normally for about 10 minutes, then suddenly shifted from orange to a sickly green color that cast everything in an unhealthy pallor. "What the hell?" Brian poked at the logs with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks that looked more like tiny insects in the weird light. "Bad wood, maybe?" Kevin suggested weakly. "Something chemical in it?" But we all knew that wasn't right. This was old-growth forest. Nothing chemical should have been anywhere near here. The fire returned to normal orange flames after a few minutes, but the incident left us all on edge. We ate our dinner in relative quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts and growing unease. Ryan was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "We're not where we're supposed to be," he said quietly, staring into the fire. "I don't mean just geographically. I mean, this place feels wrong." "Don't start with that supernatural bullshit," Brian said, but his usual bluster sounded forced. "I'm not talking supernatural. I'm talking about the fact that we've been hiking for 8 hours and haven't seen a single other person. No day hikers, no other campers, no park rangers. In October in Michigan, during peak foliage season?" He was right, and we all knew it. The Porcupine Mountains were popular precisely because of the fall colors. The trails should have been busy with tourists and photographers. Danny tried to rally our spirits. "Look, we'll figure it out in the morning. Worst case, we follow our own footprints back to the car. We've got food and water for 3 days." But when I woke up around 2 in the morning to take a piss, I discovered our first real problem. My sleeping bag was unzipped, completely open from the inside as if I'd done it myself. But I distinctly remembered zipping it closed when I'd gotten in. The night air was freezing, and there was no way I would have unzipped it deliberately. I looked around the campsite. All 5 sleeping bags were unzipped and hanging open, though my friends were still inside them, apparently asleep. It didn't make sense. Why would we all unzip our bags on such a cold night? I zipped mine back up and tried to return to sleep, but the feeling of wrongness was overwhelming now. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified and menacing. Branches creaking in the wind sounded like footsteps. The distant call of an owl became something hunting us. And then I heard the breathing. Not the normal, steady breathing of sleeping friends, but something else, deeper, more deliberate, coming from just outside our circle of tents. I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. There it was again, a slow, predatory inhalation followed by a pause that went on too long before the exhale. I wanted to wake the others, but some primal instinct kept me frozen. Whatever was out there, I had the horrible feeling that drawing its attention would be a very bad idea. The breathing circled our campsite. I tracked its movement by sound as it made a complete circuit around us, pausing for long moments at each tent. When it stopped outside mine, I bit down on my sleeping bag to keep from whimpering. The presence was so close I could feel its attention like weight pressing down on me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, The breathing moved away. I didn't fall back asleep. Morning brought new horrors. Our food supplies had rotted overnight, everything from sealed packages to canned goods. The bread was covered in fuzzy black mold, the apples had turned to brown mush, and even the energy bars had somehow spoiled. Only our water remained untainted. "How is this possible?" Kevin kept asking, holding up a can of beans that should have been fine but was now bloated and leaking some kind of dark fluid. "These were sealed. They can't just rot like this." Danny tried to maintain leadership, but I could see the fear creeping into his eyes. "We head back, right now, no discussion." But the trail we'd followed into the clearing had vanished. Where there should have been a clear path back to the main trail, there was only thick forest. No broken branches, no footprints in the soft earth, no sign that 5 people had ever walked that way. "This is impossible," Brian said, his voice rising toward panic. "Trails don't just disappear." We spread out, searching for any sign of the path we'd taken. But after an hour of increasingly frantic searching, we had to face the truth. We were lost in forest that seemed to be actively working against us. That's when Kevin disappeared. He'd been searching about 30 yards to the east, still visible through the trees, when he called out that he might have found something. We all turned toward the sound of his voice, but when we looked, he wasn't there. "Kevin!" Danny shouted. "Where are you?" No response. We searched for 2 hours, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. Brian climbed trees to get a better view. Ryan methodically worked through the underbrush in a grid pattern. But Kevin was simply gone, as if the forest had swallowed him. The worst part was the silence. No sounds of someone crashing through the woods, no calls for help, no indication of which direction he might have gone. Just absence. "We need to keep moving," Danny finally said. "Find our way out and get help." But Ryan shook his head. "We can't leave him. We can't help him if we're lost too," Danny argued, though he looked sick about it. In the end, we compromised. We'd try to find a way out, but mark our path so we could lead rescuers back to this area. It was a reasonable plan that made everyone feel slightly less terrible about abandoning Kevin. We picked a direction that felt downhill. Water always flows downhill, and water eventually leads to civilization, and started walking. The forest seemed to resist our progress. Branches caught at our clothes and skin with unusual frequency. Roots rose from the ground to trip us. The underbrush grew thicker with each step until we were forcing our way through what felt like a deliberately constructed maze. That's when we started hearing Kevin's voice. Guys, where are you?" The voice came from different directions, never quite close enough to pinpoint. Sometimes ahead of us, sometimes behind, sometimes off to the side. We'd call back and run toward the sound, but we never found him. "Kevin!" Brian would shout. "Keep talking, we're coming." But the voice would go silent, only to reappear minutes later from somewhere else entirely. "Over here, I think I found the trail." We'd scramble through the brush toward the sound, but find nothing. No Kevin, no trail, just more endless forest. The worst part was that something about the voice felt off. The words were Kevin's, the tone was Kevin's, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, the inflection, like someone doing a very good impression but not quite getting it right. Ryan was the first to voice what we were all starting to suspect. "That's not Kevin," he whispered during one of the silent periods. "Don't start," Brian warned, but his heart wasn't in it. "Listen to how he's talking. Kevin doesn't say guys, he calls us by name, always has." He was right. In all the years we'd known him, Kevin had this habit of addressing us individually, even in group conversations. "Danny, what do you think?" Or, "Brian, give me a hand with this." Never just, "Guys," the voice called out again. "Guys, I'm hurt, I need help." We looked at each other, none of us moving toward the sound. "That's not him," Ryan said with certainty. But if it wasn't Kevin, what was it? And where was our friend? We kept moving, ignoring the voice when it called to us. This seemed to anger whatever was making the sounds because they became more frequent and more desperate. Why won't you help me? I'm bleeding. Please, I think my leg is broken. It's getting dark. Don't leave me out here." Each plea was perfectly crafted to maximize our guilt and fear, but the voice had given itself away with that first "guys," and now we could hear other small wrongnesses. The way certain words were emphasized, the slight echo that shouldn't have been there in open forest, the fact that the voice never seemed to be breathing between sentences. As the real sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we found ourselves in another small clearing. This one had no convenient fire ring, just a roughly circular space where the trees gave way to tangled grass and exposed stone. "We'll have to camp here," Danny said. "Try to get a fire going. Stay warm." But when Brian tried to light our kindling, the flames wouldn't catch. The wood was dry, our matches were working fine, but every fire we attempted simply refused to burn, as if the forest itself was denying us warmth and light. "The hell with this," Brian muttered and started breaking dry branches to build a bigger pile. That's when we heard the real Kevin screaming. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the forest, a raw shriek of pure terror that raised every hair on my body. It was definitely Kevin. There was no mistaking the voice now, and he was in agony. Without thinking, we all ran toward the sound. Branches whipped at our faces, roots caught our feet, but we crashed through the underbrush toward our friend's cries. The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving us stumbling through the dark forest calling his name into silence. We searched until exhaustion forced us to stop. With no fire and rapidly dropping temperatures, we huddled together in the clearing and tried to survive the night. But sleep was impossible. The forest around us was alive with sounds. Footsteps circling us, branches breaking, and worst of all, that slow, deliberate breathing I'd heard the night before. Only now there seemed to be more than one thing out there. "Do you smell that?" Ryan whispered around midnight. I'd been trying to ignore it, but now that he'd mentioned it, the smell was impossible to miss. Something rotten, like meat that had been left in the sun too long. Sweet and cloying and fundamentally wrong. The smell grew stronger as the night wore on, until it was almost overwhelming. But dawn brought something worse than the stench. Kevin walked into our clearing just as the first light was filtering through the trees. At first, we were overjoyed. Brian actually cried with relief as Kevin approached, and Danny started babbling questions about where he'd been and if he was hurt. But something stopped me from rushing forward with the others. Maybe it was the way Kevin moved. Too smooth, too quiet, like he was floating just slightly above the ground. Maybe it was how perfectly clean he looked after supposedly spending 2 days lost in the forest. Or maybe it was his smile, which stretched just a little too wide and lasted just a little too long. "Kevin," I called out cautiously, "are you okay?" He turned that too wide smile toward me. "I'm fine, Michael. Better than fine. I found something wonderful out there." The way he said my name made my skin crawl. Kevin had always called me Mike, never Michael. In 8 years of friendship, I don't think he'd ever used my full name. "Where have you been?" Danny asked. "We've been looking everywhere for you." "I got lost," Kevin said, his smile never wavering. "But they found me. They showed me things, Michael. Beautiful things." There it was again, Michael instead of Mike. And his eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. They were the right color, the right shape, but they didn't blink. At all. Ryan had noticed, too. I could see him backing away slowly, his face pale with recognition that something was fundamentally wrong with our friend. "Who found you?" Brian asked, still too relieved to notice the wrongness. "The hungry ones," Kevin said, and his smile got even wider, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. "They're so grateful for what you've brought them." That's when Danny finally realized what Ryan and I had already figured out. This thing wearing Kevin's face wasn't our friend. "Run," Danny whispered. The Kevin thing's head snapped toward him with inhuman speed. "Where are you going? Don't you want to meet them? They've been waiting so long for fresh meat." We scattered in different directions. Brian, still not fully convinced, hesitated for a fatal second. The thing that looked like Kevin moved faster than anything human should be able to, covering the distance between them in a single, impossible leap. I don't want to describe what happened to Brian. I don't want to remember the sounds he made or the way the Kevin thing's face split open to reveal something that belonged in nightmares. But I'll never forget how Brian's screams cut off abruptly, replaced by wet, tearing sounds. Danny, Ryan, and I crashed through the forest in blind panic. Behind us, something that had once been our friend was making sounds like a pack of wolves feeding. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a massive fallen log. In the distance, we could hear movement. Lots of movement, as if the thing that had taken Kevin had been joined by others. "What the hell was that?" Danny gasped. "Wendigo," Ryan said quietly. "Or something like it. Something that wears faces of people it's killed." I wanted to argue, to insist there had to be a rational explanation. But rational explanations don't account for friends who disappear and return wrong, for forests that rearrange themselves, for food rotting overnight in sealed containers. "How do we get out of here?" I asked. Ryan shook his head. "I don't think we do. This place, it's not on any map. It's not really part of our world." As if in response to his words, we heard the Kevin thing calling to us from somewhere in the forest. "Mai, Iko, Danny, Rai, Han, why did you run away? I have friends who want to meet you." The voice was still recognizably Kevin's, but distorted now, echoing strangely through the trees. "We're going to die here," Danny said flatly, but Ryan was studying the forest around us with the same intense focus he brought to his design work. "Maybe not," he said slowly. "Look at the trees." It took me a moment to see what he was seeing. The trees around us weren't random. They formed patterns almost like symbols or letters carved into the landscape itself. "It's a maze," Ryan continued. "The whole forest is laid out like a maze, and mazes have solutions." It was a thin hope, but it was all we had. Using Ryan's eye for spatial relationships, we began to navigate the forest more deliberately. Instead of running blindly, we looked for patterns, for the subtle clues that suggested which direction might lead toward an exit. Behind us, the Kevin thing continued calling, sometimes joined by other voices. Brian's voice, then other voices we didn't recognize. People who had probably wandered into this place years or decades ago, all of them now part of whatever hungry intelligence controlled this pocket of wrongness. The forest fought us every step of the way. Paths that seemed clear would suddenly end in impenetrable thickets. We'd climb over fallen logs only to find ourselves back where we started. But Ryan's eye for patterns kept us moving in what felt like the right direction, even when the landscape seemed to shift around us. It took hours, and we lost track of time in the perpetual twilight under the canopy. The voices behind us grew closer, then farther away, as if our pursuers were playing with us, letting us think we might escape before closing in for the kill. But finally, impossibly, we saw daylight ahead. Real daylight, streaming through normal trees that looked like they belonged in the regular world. We ran toward it, not daring to believe until we broke through the tree line and found ourselves standing on a paved road. A state highway with painted lines and mile markers and all the beautiful mundane details of civilization. A car was approaching in the distance, the first sign of other humans we'd seen in 3 days. Danny stepped into the road and waved frantically until the vehicle stopped. The driver was a park ranger who looked at our condition with immediate concern. "You boys okay? You look like you've been through hell." "Our friends," Danny gasped. "We lost our friends in the forest. Kevin Allen and Brian Carter. We need to organize a search." The ranger's expression grew puzzled. "What forest? This is all farmland for miles around here." We turned to look back the way we'd come and saw cornfields stretching to the horizon. No forest, no trees, no sign of the nightmare we'd just escaped. But I could swear I heard Kevin's voice carried on the wind, calling our names from somewhere far away. The ranger took us to the nearest hospital, where we were treated for exhaustion and exposure. We told the authorities about our missing friends, gave detailed statements, and submitted to questioning that grew increasingly skeptical as our story became clear. How do you explain to a rational person that you lost 2 friends in a forest that doesn't exist? How do you describe creatures that wear human faces to people who've never seen anything worse than a raccoon in garbage can? They searched, of course. Helicopters with thermal imaging, ground teams with dogs, volunteers combing every inch of the Porcupine Mountains wilderness. They found our car right where we'd left it, but no trace of Kevin or Brian. No signs of any struggle, no evidence that they'd ever existed. The official report listed them as missing persons, presumed dead in a hiking accident. Case closed. Danny, Ryan, and I never talked about what really happened. What would be the point? But I know they have the same nightmares I do. The same cold sweats when they hear voices calling their names from empty rooms. I moved to Arizona after that, as far from forests as I could get. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the desert sage, I swear I can hear Kevin's voice calling to me. "Me, Kel, where are you? Come back to the forest, Michael. My friends are still hungry." And someday, God help me, I'm afraid I might answer.